It has been a long year traveling through From Software's Souls-like library, but we have finally come to our conclusion. It is time for an analysis of the bosses of Elden Ring's DLC and now Game of the Year contender, Shadow of the Erdtree, which boasts 42 more boss encounters, bringing the total in Elden Ring to 208. For those who haven't seen the rest of this series, I'm Akashiros. I try to analyze the visual and audio design, boss moveset, and mechanics, and give my opinion on how well it all comes together to create a memorable experience. Boss analyses are always partially subjective, but I try to be as objective as possible when it comes to the moves themselves. You'll see two builds in this video. My first run played blind with 2 katanas, and a New Game Plus build with a greatsword and shield, which was my second playthrough. I'll be grading each of the bosses from an F to an S grade. An F grade boss is something that not only fails to create a satisfying encounter, but actively detracts from the game in some way. A D grade boss fails as an encounter, but doesn't detract from the rest of the game. A C grade boss is a decent fight. It doesn't make the player upset, but it doesn't shine in any way either. A B grade is an above average fight, but it has issues holding it back from being among the best of the best. An A-grade boss is the kind of fight that makes you want to play the game over again, and an S-grade is reserved for the best of the best. Fights that, the moment they ended, made me immediately want to start them again. So, without further ado, let us step into the shadow of the Erdtree. Tucked away among new remembrances and mini-bosses are 4 nameless mausoleum battles, NPCs decked out in DLC gear in these small, straightforward rooms. The first of these is the boss who often ends up being people's first boss encounter in the DLC, the artist previously known as the Black Gaol Knight, now retranslated to Knight of the Solitary Gaol. NPC fights are always going to feel limited compared to a full encounter, but the NPCs in the DLC are usually better than the NPC bosses in the base game, save for Gideon Ofnir, who I really enjoy. In the case of this knight, he boasts high damage, especially if the player doesn't have any Scadutree blessings, and a ton of poise. Unless you come back later in the DLC, he is not an NPC that the player can comfortably trade with. Outside of jump attacks and a wind-creating Ash of War, the Black Gaol Knight outputs most of his threat in charge attacks or a 2 to 4 hit combo that covers a lot of space in front of him. Throughout his whole moveset, he poses a solid threat at any range, and he does a lot of damage to an unprepared player. On top of that, the Knight of the Solitary Gaol has a repeating crossbow that is very difficult to challenge. It does a ton of damage, absolutely shreds a stamina bar if you try to block, but does leave him open if you manage to run around the assault. I'm really glad they went with this rather than a great shield, because it makes the knight feel a lot more aggressive and exciting, and utilizing sprinting as a dodge makes the fight feel a lot more dynamic. With a hefty 14,000 hit points and plenty of damage negation, players without any blessings will actually have a fairly long and deadly fight to look forward to. The knight heals with an Estus once during the fight too, meaning he actually sits more at around 20,000 health. That means without blessings, he is just below the same level of durability as Godfrey in the base game, which is an absolutely wild stat. One thing I found entertaining as I watched streamers and challenge runners encounter the knight is that they all love his crossbow. I mean, repeating flaming crossbow, that's just cool. Upon his defeat though, he drops every single item he uses except for that crossbow. It ends up being a little disappointing that his most memorable attack is also the only one that you won't get when you manage to come out on top, even if the rest of the gear is still solid. Though he is limited as an NPC boss, the Knight of the Solitary Gaol presents enough of a threat and has enough bulk that he feels like a notable encounter. His refusal to trade immediately sets the tone that the enemies in this DLC need to be respected. I think he earns a B grade, setting a solid tone for the more detailed side bosses that Shadow of the Erdtree aims to have. I've never been the biggest fan of the dragon enemies, but the DLC has no shortage of new dragons to face. These new dragons, however, boast a few more moves that I feel made their moveset a lot more engaging, both on horseback and on foot. Instead of a head bash upwards and a single wing thrust that provided effectively no risk at all if you stood on Torrent or were under him, the Ghostflame dragon now uses a double wing swipe and a 3-hit charge that can pose a huge risk if the player isn't properly spacing on Torrent. Previously, if you knew the positioning, being on Torrent meant that the dragons were effectively harmless. Though it's still reliable, the dragon being able to leap away and then charge in provided some encouragement for being on foot, because being on foot means you can roll through and use the invincibility frames to great effect, being next to the head and getting some bonus damage. On top of that, it demands more intentional torrent positioning in order to avoid it, backing further away or being close enough that you can sneak behind him before the attack begins. And of course, that's on top of the positioning already required by the still very lethal Fire Breath. Fighting on torrent will always be safer than fighting on foot when it comes to the dragons, but this is a big step in the right direction. The Ghostflame dragon has a ton of health compared to the base game brethren, with a whopping 31,000 hit points and an immunity to every status except for Scarlet Rot, which far eclipses the end of the base game Drake's health, which was usually around 11,000. Our favorite Rot Drake, Big E, also had a lot of health, yes, but he was also weak to every damage source to balance that out. The Ghostflame dragons do have weaknesses though. Strike weapons, which don't get resisted quite as much as other damage sources, and Holy, which is the best way to deal damage to the dragon. An Undead Dragon is an amazing visual fantasy, and the weaknesses combine with the massive health bar to encourage the use of various damage types really well. When you combine that with a few moves that make the moveset more engaging, I end up preferring this DLC upgrade to the standard dragon equation a lot, even if I wish that we could have another song to go with this dragon. The song, Dragon, is 90 seconds long and already isn't my favorite, and it plays so frequently in the base game. Every dragonkin, that huge impactful starting chord ends up being very familiar by the time it bursts in again here. Though seeing an already over-repeated boss appear once more in the DLC wasn't my favorite, I did enjoy this battle, and the new aesthetic justifies at least the first encounter with the dragon. I think the Ghostflame dragon earns a B grade, working better than any of the base game dragons did. And swapping gears from a dragon in a big way, we travel to Demi-Human Swordmaster Onze, who manages to be both hilarious and threatening. Some people consider Malenia to be a Sekiro enemy, but the Demi-Human Swordmaster parries your incoming attacks to set you up, which I think is absolutely hilarious. Once you beat the fight, you're also rewarded with summoning this enemy as a Spirit Ash if you win, which means this Demi-Human looking cool and making you feel cooler for having him is definitely the point of the fight. Onze is a comparatively fragile boss to the rest of the DLC thus far, only boasting 7,400 hit points. In a DLC where you can eventually scale your damage to be multiplied by 2, that health bar can vanish very quickly. Despite that, though, the Swordmaster feels suitably like a glass cannon if you find him in your initial exploration of the plains. He teleports with downward slams, turns to mist mid-combo as he dances around the player, he has a Frostbite AoE, a quick and long-range grab, and then he combines all that with that fast parry, with the parry also working really smoothly. The parry doesn't lock the player into getting hit, instead putting them into a tight spot where they really need to time their next dodges specifically as they get back into an advantageous position. His attacks close the distance really fast, but he can also be staggered in a single blow, which allows the player to stop his momentum whenever they find a window to break through. Despite being a very fast and aggressive boss, Onze never feels overwhelming. He lands in a really good spot for a dungeon miniboss, despite his underwhelming initial visual design. Demi-humans have struggled a lot in the base game to feel like satisfying boss encounters, especially in one-on-one fights, but Onze finally manages to land it. It's entertaining to watch him fly around and satisfying to learn how to dodge and punish the barrage. He's fragile enough to not feel like a marathon of an encounter, while also threatening enough that he feels like a satisfying conclusion to his dungeon. I think the Demi-Human Onze earns a high B grade. If he had a little more depth or some more health, I could easily see him getting an A, but he is still a fairly simple encounter. Also, I promise not every boss in this analysis is going to get a B grade, but a lot of these first fights are solid without being incredible. The base game of Elden Ring had 15 remembrances among 165 encounters. My favorite part about the DLC is that there are 10 remembrances, 11 if you count Bayle, against 42 bosses, meaning we're getting at least one remembrance boss about every 4 encounters, rather than a remembrance boss only every 11, and that tempo feels a lot nicer than the long string of nothing encounters that the base game would frequently stumble into. The first remembrance of the DLC is also one of only 4 remembrances boasting a cutscene, the Divine Beast Dancing Lion. The first thing to mention here is the beast's design. It looks incredible. The way it moves is unlike anything else in the game, as the lion alternates between feeling real and controlled by the two men inside it, to feeling like a living, sentient object twisting and curling around itself in unnatural ways. The moveset is vast and hard to learn, and attacks often come out fast or on strange delays, meaning it's hard to tell when combos end. Combined with an excellent thematic soundtrack, the atmosphere of this fight feels incredible. In terms of the moveset itself, the Dancing Lion has bites, spins, jumps, and this huge grab, as well as an Ash Breath that either needs to be run from or jumped over. I'm not the biggest fan of the triple spin breath because the Dancing Lion moves a lot during the attack. It feels great to jump over or block one of the spins, but if a player is locked on, which they often will be to keep track of the Dancing Lion, they'll easily find themselves pressed against a wall as the Divine Lion pushes towards them, or they'll themselves push into the lion, where the camera ends up freaking out. On top of that, the Dancing Lion has a solid health bar, coming in at 22,500 hit points, which is more than the Elden Beast, albeit made lesser via Scadutree fragments providing that damage boost. Once you reach 60% of the Dancing Lion's health bar, the second phase begins, and this phase transition works insanely well. The music intensifies to my favorite track of the DLC, and the Dancing Lion calls down a lightning storm. His attacks gain lightning after effects, and the Dancing Lion starts to throw lightning bolts that create follow-up AoEs. Though bolts of lightning can often be frustrating when they spawn inconveniently, the escalation still works really well here, and the fight still feels fair. Then the player realizes phase 2 is more than just lightning, as the lion starts to enter frost and wind phases as well. For the rest of the fight, it swaps between these three phases constantly. The wind phase adds ranged projectiles to the end of most attacks, and personally was the easiest of the three forms for me to learn. The frost phase, on the other hand, is the one I struggle with the most, as these huge hoarfrost AoEs explode out at the end of almost every combo. Though it helps punctuate the end of attack strings more, and thus made me better at the first phase of the fight, jumping only works on some of these burst attacks, and the timing is often a little too tight for my taste. As you get to the lowest part of the health bar, there is a combo attack where the Divine Lion uses all three of the elements, and I love the way that these all link together over his usual combo. It escalates the already tense battle even further while not bringing the momentum or the tempo of the fight down, because the attack happens and then it's done just as quickly as any other combo. The biggest issue with the Divine Beast is learning the moveset. As I mentioned, it's not a very intuitive set of moves. Once you start to learn the tempo of the fight and feel where the windows are rather than see them, it works really well, but it ends up being a frustrating learning process as the strange combos don't click until you've been hit by them a couple of times. There's a lot of frustration online with the Divine Lion because of how it moves. It is fair, it's not one of the hardest fights in the game, but it is really tough to learn. I think that the Divine Beast Dancing Lion rests right at the top of the B grade. The atmosphere and the way the dodge timings click together make the fight above average for me, but the often bizarre camera and unnatural timings combined with strange AoEs and some heavy focus on random number generation in the lightning phase, which leads to frustration holding it back from that A grade. I also want to mention that the placement of the Divine Beast Dancing Lion in the world is bizarre. This is clearly designed to be one of the first bosses the player finds, being balanced to be fought with only a couple Scadutree blessings. On top of that, it rests at the entrance to the DLC's final dungeon. But once the player beats the two bosses they need to access that final dungeon, being Messmer and Ranah, they're teleported right behind where the Dancing Lion was. This means that the Dancing Lion is an early boss that foreshadows a later area by protecting its entrance, but then once you get to that area, you just teleport behind it, meaning it doesn't even really matter and was doing a horrible job protecting that entrance anyway. Just a bit of a strange design choice. Though the stars of the DLC are the Remembrance fights, the Death Knights stick out among the crowd of encounters, and Death Knights are picture-perfect mini-bosses. There are two variations, and the first found in the plains dual-wield axes. The Death Knight has a collection of detailed melee attacks, none of which ever feel too overwhelming or oppressive. The combos last long enough to feel like more than a mob, but also leave plenty of windows at the end of each of them. The animators made sure that the Death Note ends almost every combo visually off balance and takes a moment to recover, which means it's always clear when it is safe for the player to attack. Past that, the Death Knight has a lot of lightning magical attacks. this teleport forward that he uses to lead into a melee combo, a double spinning rush forward that ends with a huge slam dealing a ton of damage but leaving a window to counterattack or recover afterwards, a lightning AoE that can cover the area around the knight twice and encourages the player to jump, or a lightning bolt that is followed by a collection of other smaller bolts. To bring the whole thing together, the Death Knight also has one grab attack, often used only once or twice throughout the battle. If the player doesn't dodge, the Death Knight not only does damage, but also heals for a majority of its health bar, with a surprisingly low 9600 health made only more durable by a 40% resistance to every damage type but Pierce, Fire, and Holy. The Death Knight manages to both feel on the fragile side while also having the capacity to become a marathon of a battle if the player misses one or two dodges. Though it puts a lot of weight on those few moments, the fight and health bar are short enough that being grabbed isn't a death sentence. It's a satisfying fight, everything looks really cool, and it makes for a challenging battle without being overwhelming or taking as long as a remembrance to learn. The Death Knight is the mark of what I wish every boss in Elden Ring was. There is a moveset here to master that lacks the demand and detail of the major bosses, while still being detailed enough that it doesn't roll over like so many of the bosses that fill the endless dungeons in the base game. When I started my second playthrough of the DLC, I was excited to go back through these dungeons again because I was so ready to fight the Death Knight one more time. I've never been excited to run a random optional Elden Ring dungeon, that's just not something that the base game did. You can look at other good mini-bosses like the ones that began this video, but they pale in comparison to the Death Knight. He is easily a high A-grade fight, and I even debated an S-grade for a while. After all, the only thing missing compared to the others is the spectacle and scale of main bosses, but the Death Knight isn't trying to provide that. In some ways, he is doing his job perfectly. He doesn't steal thunder from the main bosses, instead supplementing the adventuring experience. Chief Bloodfiend is a strange battle. The Bloodfiends are standard enemies, and the Chief Bloodfiend is a giant version of that enemy on speed. The Chief moves faster than the basic enemies, and his moveset integrates more leaps and slams than the player-sized foes did. On top of those new swings, he also has Mohg's exploding claw move and a breath attack that builds up bleed on the player around them. I can't put my finger on why, but this entire fight feels surreal compared to the rest of the DLC. I can best describe it as it feels like a modder repurposed an enemy and put it in this room. An exceptionally talented modder, I should mention, but it just doesn't feel like a real boss fight. The biggest issue with the moveset is that most of it was designed for a creature about the same size as the player. With the Chief upscaled and pressing forward and against the player with almost every attack, he has a habit of stepping over the player. The Mohg Claw will often just completely miss the player without them needing to do anything as it claws so far forward, whereas his stomps are often unreactable. The low damage means that that's not ever a critical problem, but it makes for a fight that has a hard time clicking into place like the other battles in the DLC have up to this point. Beyond that, the arena is decently memorable, being a blood-drenched underground cave, which delivers the fight's theme pretty well. Overall, Chief Bloodfiend is a D-grade boss fight. He doesn't have any horrific design I can point to, but he also doesn't come together into a fight that feels real, and he doesn't diverge from the basic enemy in enough ways to make him feel like anything more than a supersized enemy. One of the two pathways to Dragon Murder Alley, officially called the Jagged Peak, starts the gauntlet with an NPC battle against the Ancient Dragon Man. Like the Knight, he's got a big sword and he hits like a truck, though he is significantly less durable than the Knight was. However, he makes up for that with even more ways to slaughter the player. Not only do his basic attacks inflict bleed, but he has a much faster ranged Art of War and frequently makes use of jump attacks to try and poise through things that the players are doing and land one of his devastating blows. On top of that, the Ancient Dragon Man fittingly uses two dragon incantations, a Magma Worm and a Drake. The Magma Worm spits lava forward, leaving a hazard that does decent damage, and the Drake lunges forward with a deceptively long range and hits harder than any boss up to this point. It's not much of a surprise, considering how much damage all of his attacks do, but this spell was the only time in all of the DLC playthroughs I've done that I was genuinely one-shot. Not hit by some combo that killed me, but one-shot. And when combined with his habit to backstep out of this spell, it's a really hard move to punish, and all that combined makes him one of the more lethal NPC boss fights. If the Ancient Dragon Man was just sitting at the bottom of a dungeon or in a mausoleum, I don't think he'd be as successful as he is. But he serves as a blessing test before leaving the plains and heading to the south, and effectively starts the build-up of the Jagged Peace boss gauntlet, which we'll get to far later in the video. The Ancient Dragon Man fills these roles really well, even if I personally, rather than realizing that I should really increase my blessings if I was one-shot, decided to just steamroll through and regretted it. But we will get to the Jagged Peak near the end of this video, like I was supposed to in my first run. I think the Ancient Dragon Man, like the majority of the Plains bosses, lands another B grade. Despite being an NPC encounter, he is surprisingly memorable, just from the sheer amount of damage he has, and the virtue of him having a very silly name and design. The second of the Remembrance bosses in the DLC is also one of the toughest to discuss, Rellana, the Twin Moon Knight. Personally, I consider Rellana to be the second hardest boss in the DLC, potentially even the hardest if you fight her at the intended progression. That said, there's a Spirit Spring hidden in the plains, and if you use it, you're able to get behind her and into Shadow Altus to get all the upgrades before having to take her down. If you didn't find that Spirit Spring, though, Rellana is a boss that you have to beat in order to enter Shadow Altus, which contains the bulk of the DLC. On my first playthrough, I summoned NPCs or the Mimic tier on only 3 bosses: Rellana, Bayle, and Radahn. Radahn is, of course, Radahn, we'll get to him. Bayle has an NPC built into the DNA of the encounter, and Rellana ends up being kind of the odd one out among that trio, at least from what most people seem to experience. The fact I found her as my second boss in the DLC, having only beaten the Knight of the Solitary Jail before running into her at Scadutree level 2, didn't really help things much. Long story short, I have a lot of footage of me dying. In fact, this is the boss I've died to the most in the DLC. Rellana features 2 major phases and some of the most relentless aggression in all of Elden Ring. Her lunges and hops forward can often close up to half the arena, especially when combined with her ability to quickstep or do that same glide into an attack that Malenia does. What makes Rellana so overwhelming isn't just her aggression, it's the fact that every aspect of her design is dialed up to 11. She doesn't stagger from the player's attacks, her combos are varied and deadly, and she has follow-ups that require the player to use positioning to dodge them due to how fast they come out. She has a huge resistance to slash weapons, which made my first run real rough, and almost 30,000 hit points. To give an idea of scale here, Malenia's full health bar gave her almost 18,000. And she could be staggered with almost every hit the player landed, letting them usually attack more than once. To break that math down, after the patch improving the power of Scadutree fragments, in order to see the same level of movement on Rellana's health bar that the player would see on Malenia's, you need a blessing level of 10. On release, you would have needed a blessing level of 13. I didn't even have a blessing level of 13 when I fought Messmer, to give you an idea of how much of a tank Rellana is here. The biggest struggle that I personally have with Rellana is learning when her attack strings have windows. It's far easier said than done. She makes a lot of poses that feel final, but then frequently continues to attack afterwards. Take this long lunge forward. It feels like this would be the end of a combo usually, but this is always followed by another double spin, unless of course you've made enough space for her to dynamically end her combo. With a fast enough weapon, the player can force themselves into these tiny gaps, but the punishment for mistiming an attack or dodge is heavy damage, and, especially in the second phase, often a quick death. On top of all these combos, Rellana has 3 spells that she'll use: a magic wave that is mercifully straightforward to dodge, or 2 versions of a magic phalanx. One that stays over her head and will track the player during her next combo, or one that she pushes forwards herself. These add some fun, dynamic nature to the start of a lot of these attacks, and are a great way that she punishes flask use at a distance. Rather than just throwing a black flame to stagger the player out of healing, she makes the moment of re-engagement with the boss more complex, which is just a lot more fun of a mechanic. She gains one more attack halfway through the first phase, where she summons the Carrion Greatsword, smashing it down and spinning. This is actually one of the most punishable attacks once the player learns how to dodge it. It is more damaging than the bread and butter combos from the rest of the phase, and the window is small enough that if a player fails to dodge, they won't be able to heal or attack afterwards, but it's also large enough that if they stay in close and dodge successfully, they'll have plenty of time to punish, even if they're using a heavier weapon. Even on my first playthrough though, it wasn't this phase that I needed to have my spirit summon out for. It was the second phase. Though it's not as intense as the escalation we'll encounter with Radahn, Phase 2 of Rellana increases her high damage to frankly absurd amounts. I was at Blessing level 7 after the Blessing patch on New Game Plus in Meteor Armor on this playthrough, and I would still frequently have my health bar completely annihilated in an instant here, with defensive talismans. Not only does Rellana increase the potency of her already existing attack strings, not only does she increase the number of phalanx she summons, not only do the basic attacks gain additional magic waves and fire after explosions that close what were previous openings, but she also changes the endings of all of her attack strings, adding in even more follow-ups that need to be learned. This cross-slash used to be a safe moment to counterattack, and now it is not. If you learned the timing of the double spin she uses after those lunges, it's time to unlearn that because she is spinning 5 times now. Like the first phase, there are openings that do still exist, but like the first phase, the only way you're going to learn them is through death after death after death, and the fact that the end of strings aren't clear makes that learning process even rougher than the Divine Beast, especially if you're not using a shield, and combined with the fact that in order to try to start learning these, you have to muscle through that first phase in order to get a chance to start breaking the traditions that you built up getting through that first phase. And of course, there's one more attack to dive into here, and it's a great move to talk about my favorite design part of the DLC as a whole, the moons. Rellana drops 2 moons, then slams into the ground. These attacks cover the entire arena, do a ton of damage and cannot be rolled through, and combo into each other. They can, however, each be jumped. The DLC very much encourages player to be using the jump button to dodge in a way the base game never quite did. We've already seen it with the Divine Lion's Spinning Breath and the Death Knight's Lightning AoEs, and it exists again here with the moons, unavoidable jumps. The base game of Elden Ring honestly doesn't do a great job training players to jump over attacks, whereas the DLC does the opposite. Almost every single remembrance has something that encourages the player to jump to make the dodge easier, which makes every remembrance feel detailed and thus more full as a result. The moves feel like an increase in spectacle, can be punished if you aren't bad at spacing, and encourage that unique dodging. So, with all of my criticism of Rellana's moveset being difficult to learn and that sheer brutality that the damage in the second phase offers, where do I think she falls? Well, personally, Rellana is absolutely an S-grade boss fight. Yes, her moveset is hard to learn, and the fact that the end of her combos aren't clearly communicated through the animations does hold her back from being the best boss in the game in my opinion, but just look at this. I may have needed a shield to really engage with the boss, but on New Game Plus with no summons, I got only a tick away from victory on my 4th attempt. There are gaps, and once the player learns them, Rellana becomes ridiculously satisfying. I do think that the second phase is overtuned, but she is an early DLC challenge made optional via exploration, which means that using summons, which work really well for drawing the attention of what I believe is an intentionally directional moveset, is a great way to get past her on a first attempt. And the opportunity to increase your own scaling via exploration before you face her means that everyone will be able to challenge her at a proper level. Unlike the Divine Beast, who feels abnormal not being required, the fact that Rellana is secretly optional with game knowledge improves the fight a lot, because it means that the player can always loop back around to fight her at a difficulty level that clicks better. Visually, too, though she lacks a cutscene or any direct spectacle to the level of some of the bigger Remembrance bosses, Rellana fills the space of this arena in a way other bosses wish they could. Her music feels like this frantic dance, and though I'm not as big a fan of her second phase and the way it often has to be learned through trial and error, the core moveset just feels so good to punish. And although punishing clear opens is the boss design I've always personally preferred, the feeling of satisfaction that you get beating a boss that felt like they had no openings is something a boss like Rellana provides expertly. This does lead me to a little bit of a backtrack to part 3 of this video, of the one grade in this series that I believe was not quite fair. Malekith was similarly designed to feel initially unpunishable, and the comments in the last video pointed that out. I've done a couple low-level runs since then, and they've convinced me that the emphasis on positioning in the second phase and the number of vulnerabilities using the jump can reveal in the first phase make that fight similarly satisfying. I had Malekith as a B-grade boss, but in retrospect, that was definitely too low. I think he deserves an A grade. The reason why he's an A grade rather than an S grade is there are growing pains not just in learning where to position, but also how to manipulate his AI to get the correct moves to come out, which is something Rellana avoids by focusing entirely on animation and moveset rather than maneuverability. In part 1 of this series, I praised the battle with the Death Rite bird in Liurnia. Despite enemies in Liurnia frequently feeling sporadically placed amid ruins and huge open spaces, the Death Rite bird found there was placed in such a way that there is a ton of space in every direction to fight the bird without a single interruption. It avoids the frustration of mobs running in and disrupting the overworld battle, while also providing enough space to effectively dodge the Death Rite bird's attacks. After all, one of the largest struggles with the birds as enemies is how frustrating the camera can become with their frantic and wild movements. Adding enemies into that does not work well. Apparently, though, whoever decided where to place the DLC variation of the Death Rite bird heard that review and decided to do the opposite of that. I am still a Death Rite bird defender overall, but this was not a great showing for the boss fight. Not only are there grave birds scattered around the arena that need to be killed first, unless the player wants to fight them alongside the Death Rite bird, but there are a ton of grave birds further onto the lake that will join the fight if the player ever chases the Death Rite bird, and its habit to constantly fly around can lead to this being a long fight, where the player is trapped in a small space while the Death Rite bird flies around and does whatever it wants, wherever it wants. On top of that, there are a lot of graves sticking up in what is already a pretty restricted space, and it's easy to get caught on them or find yourself forced to either put your back against the wall or be put into a space where the grave birds are going to wake up and attack you from behind. I'm pretty comfortable saying this is the worst Death Rite bird arena. But past the arena, the Death Rite bird's scaling here feels solid. With around 29,000 health, the Death Rite bird is just short of Rellana in terms of bulk, but with a weakness to strike and holy damage, as well as that undead vulnerability, it's a lot easier to dig into this health bar than Rellana's. There aren't any new moves or anything wrong with the boss itself, but in the same way that Liurnia elevated the boss, this arena holds the bird back. The atmosphere still lands expertly, but everything else is a downgrade from better versions of this fight. This is the worst of the Death Rite birds, only earning a C grade. Though the arena is bad, I still enjoy the base moveset of the Death Rite bird, and the atmosphere provides enough to keep the fight from going into the negative grades. Most NPC bosses in Shadow of the Erdtree increased their damage and health to make the otherwise less spectacular battles still feel somewhat more matched to the more developed bosses. Lamenter, meanwhile, takes a completely different direction and, to put it briefly, fails to capture that same feeling. Lamenter wields a lantern and does basically no damage with it. He is staggered by any attack that the player does, and with only 12,200 hit points and every single resistance being negative, he has no bulk. The only threat or point of interest in this fight is that the Lamenter regularly teleports away, stays gone for what feels like ages, and then reappears with a horde of clones. There's no way to tell these clones visually apart, and even with all their damage stacked, the Lamenter is still posing no physical threat. The clones die in one hit, or the player can find the Lamenter through process of elimination and wail away on the health bar. There is one silent mechanic at play here that serves as the only threat during the battle, one I didn't even realize existed until I was doing my research for this video. After the clone phase ends, which is not when you hit the Lamenter, but when the Lamenter decides to end the phase, the player receives a debuff that floats around them for every clone that they didn't destroy. Once the player has a certain number of these debuffs, they die. That means there are two strategies in this fight. You Unga Bunga to find the main Lamenter and hammer the attack button of choice, or you run around the clone phase and hit everyone. There's no back and forth engagement or additional choices that this mechanic really adds to the fight. It only even matters if the player lacks the damage necessary in order to mash the Lamenter to death. Though I don't think the Lamenter quite earns the bottom honors, it is a low D grade boss on the best of days. The unique mechanic is boring and not clearly visually communicated to the player. Before doing any research, it felt like an NPC with no health or damage and a very boring clone phase. Recurring already is another Ghostflame dragon. Though the dragon looks especially good against the gorgeous landscape that is the Cerulean coast, this dragon participates in my least favorite boss trope. The moveset here is fully identical, which is a bit underwhelming when dragons in the base game at least tried to have a unique identity, even if those identities often struggled to land. This Ghostflame dragon is tankier than the first, boasting 39,000 health with the same resistances and weaknesses, but the increase to health feels fairly natural alongside the blessings that the player will have acquired going into the coast. It's still brutal without holy damage, which also does a great job encouraging attacking the head in a way that the base game never did. An attempt that didn't use weaknesses takes ages, whereas targeting the head with the right damage type made the dragon feel almost fragile. But the issue with this battle, and the trope that appears, is that when he gets below half health, the Ghostflame dragon will roar and summon a small group of skeletons. Some are melee variations, some will cast spells from a distance, and all of it is obnoxious. They're hard to see against the tall flowers and the dragon's color palette, and though the dragon can technically damage them, the more limited breath attacks that the Ghostflame dragon uses compared to the base game dragons means that this dragon is legendarily bad at killing enemies around it. The damage it deals to enemies is also really low, and in the same way that fighting Death Rightbirds with enemies makes an intentionally chaotic moveset devolve into frustration, dragons don't work well with small enemies running around beneath them. Because of that, I think this Ghostflame dragon only earns a C grade. I still like the dragon template that the DLC uses, and the wide nature of the arena does mean that you can sometimes ignore some of the skeletons if your damage is high enough, but the summoned skeletons really take away from the fight. And yet another repeating boss from the main game in the coast, the Demi-Human Queen Marigga is as fragile, if not more fragile, than the last Queen boss encounter way back in Mount Gelmir. Like Maggie, the challenge here is dealing with the group of demi-humans that Marigga is supposed to lead into battle, which is a pretty decently sized and diverse group. The issue is that Maggie felt simple for the mid-game of Elden Ring, and now set in the DLC where bosses are regularly boasting 30,000 or more health and these complicated attack strings, a collection of enemies introduced in Limgrave, and a health bar of not even 10,000 hit points using Soul Arrow feels too simple for this deep into the game. The use of the group of demi-humans puts Marigga above the monstrous queens found in the basements, but it doesn't mean that there's any threat she can produce for a properly equipped and leveled player. Even when playing it safely, this fight barely took longer than a minute. If it was one of the first battles in the DLC, I'd probably give it more leeway, but the Cerulean Coast is an optional area that doesn't even fully unlock until the player has reached the Shadow Keep in the middle of Shadow Altus, which means it's possible that the player doesn't come here until they've collected enough shadow fragments that Marigga being described as a dog-faced speed bump would be a compliment. On top of that, her arena isn't great. Small rocks and outcroppings on the beach may be visually pleasing, but the enemy AI regularly gets stuck trying to jump up towards the player, making what little threat exists even more ineffective as the demi-humans take 5 seconds to very intentionally turn and jump up a small ledge. The player is constantly dealing with bizarre ledges as well, which don't make the fight harder, just more irritating as they get stuck and stop being able to move. Though the fight feels more complete than Maggie, the placement in the world means I can't give it above a D grade. It's a very nothing encounter. This late in the DLC is not the time to have a demi-human queen boss surrounded by elite demi-humans. The second of the Mausoleum NPC fights is the Dancer of Ranah, and though the concept of her design is similar to the knight before her, she's a lot less of a threat than that first foe. She does have the potential to do similarly damaging hits, but her reliance on multi-hit combos over huge single swings makes her significantly less intimidating, though more of a stylish foe. Her jump attacks and basic swings don't pose too much of a risk. There are only 2 moves that the player needs to be really aware of. The first is her dance Art of War. Spinning and twisting around, the dancer continues to attack for a long time, and she is not easily challenged during it. She can deal solid damage to a stamina bar, or punish any player who didn't immediately start to run. I often stayed in and kept trying to challenge it on my first attempt, and was frequently blindsided by how long the attack keeps going. This second move, and the more dynamic one of the moveset, is this Flame of the Red Manes type Flame Burst in front of her. It can be rolled through and punished, but if mistimed, the player can easily find themselves missing half their health bar. On the other hand, not only does she not have the poise, but she boasts about the same amount of health that the Knight of the Solitary Gaol did, both coming in at just over 14,000. The issue is that the Knight was one of the first enemies that the player finds, often without any blessings, and the Dancer of Ranah is hidden very well at the edge of the Cerulean coast. And like I mentioned with Marigga, the player will likely be well upgraded by the time they've reached here. Though I think the Dancer still works as an NPC boss, it doesn't stand out like the Knight of the Solitary Gaol did, only earning a C grade. She fulfills her role in the game, even if she doesn't stand out among the rest. And wrapping up the Cerulean coast is that boss I mentioned that you need to have reached the Shadowkeep for, the Puterscent Knight, which serves as the coast's only remembrance boss. Locked behind Miquella's charm breaking, the Puterscent Knight is one of 2 mounted bosses introduced in the DLC, and in my opinion is also the more successful of the 2. The first thing that stands out here is the design. A skeletal figure with warped and unnatural proportions wielding a scythe, riding on a half-formed horse made of a sickly-looking ooze. The horse melts in and grows out of the arena, making the knight feel like a part of the space it occupies, and the moveset takes full advantage of the knight's bizarre build, as it swells up in the second phase for certain attacks, attaches and detaches the scythe from its hands throughout the battle, and hops off the mount to attack separately in the most involved combination. On top of that, the introduction to the fight, being a long drop-in combined with the reward that follows after, an audience with Saint Trina, make this remembrance carry a real weight, again, without even using a cutscene. Though the knight is mobile, often making it hard to see when openings appear, the melee moveset here ends up being really engaging. Finding which attacks make the knight finally stand still, or predicting its movement to punish the knight's much smaller 20,600 hit point long bar means that the fight stays engaging, while the evasive nature of the boss avoids being frustrating in the same way Rellana occasionally had the capability to be, especially with the huge holy weakness all undead boast. Since the player is expected to have reached the Shadowkeep, it's a great way to check that the player is well enough leveled that every hit on the knight ends up dealing enough damage to feel like constant progress. I especially like the ranged option of the boomerang scythe and combos that end with 1 or 2 slams, and even the knight's longest combo where it charges, followed by a horse charge, then repeating that before one final charge, leaves a very satisfying window at the end where the player can land a heavy strike on the body before it tries to escape again. The second phase also plays with that same engagement with jumping that the Divine Beast and Rellana did, as the knight creates these bullet hell-esque spaces to jump over, shoots a straight pulse forward, or brings a ring of flame in towards him. The way jumping is tied into the DNA of these bosses feels so good, but there are some problems with this attack, namely depth perception. Especially when the ring is coming in towards the player, it is really unnatural to find the correct dodge timing. On top of that, it's possible to get some strange RNG on the outgoing fire, which can make dodging feel a little too tight, as waves of fire push away from the knight in any direction and can push in the same one more than once. I've seen a couple of glitches where the fire persists even after the knight is dead or staggered, which can often lead to some frustrating deaths. Overall though, I think the Puterscent Knight still earns an A grade. It's one of the easier remembrances, but it serves its role as a mid-DLC encounter that blocks access to lore, providing enough challenge to be satisfying, while not being as much of a roadblock as the main remembrances strive to be. Black Knight Garrew is one of the very few bosses in Shadow of the Erdtree that feels like a mob. Where mobs made up a large portion of the main game minor boss fights, the Curseblade and the Black Knights are the only ones that felt like mobs first, bosses second within the DLC. The only 2 differences that Garrew has from the mob variation of the Mace and Shield Black Knight is that Garrew boasts just short of 10,000 hit points and has the ability to stick out his tongue as a ranged attack. And as goofy as it looks, the tongue attack actually serves as a nice mix-up to this enemy's arsenal. His Mace and Shield strikes are much slower paced, so the tongue breaks the rhythm that the rest of the moveset utilizes. On top of that, it pulls a player towards Garrew, even if they manage to block the attack, and Garrew wants the player pressed against him, as that's when he is his most dangerous. His delayed mace strikes, shield slams, and Radagon-like AoEs apply solid pressure. Though he is a mob, the moveset here has enough depth to remain interesting, but the low stance means that it's also easy to fall into a satisfying rhythm of taking the boss down. His damage is high enough that, especially if the player finds him in early Shadow Altus, he does pose a decent threat, while not being overwhelming as a major boss. The one strange part about this fight, other than requiring an uncharacteristic run back into the open arena, is that Garrew is one of the most well-hidden bosses. When I was exploring the DLC, I had a friend tell me how many bosses were in each region. From there, I was able to find every single boss fight with only 3 exceptions. There were 2 bosses in the ancient ruins of Ruah, and Black Knight Garrew. In order to find Garrew, you have to jump off of a cliff in order to find this mob turned into a boss. It is one of the strangest placed encounters in the DLC, not because it feels like it doesn't belong in the area it's in, but because the area itself feels almost purposeless. Even with that though, Garrew does decently enough to not be offensive as a mob turned into a boss, earning a C grade. The unique move and spike in health keep him from ever feeling too boring, and he's similarly great in staying out of the way of a player who has no interest in fighting every boss fight. Technically, the Great Red Bears in the DLC are also mobs turned into boss fights, but unlike the Black Knights, there's enough significant variation within the moveset that, although it's still built from the Rune Bear movements, it feels like a boss fight proper. Boasting an absolutely terrifying 29,600 hit points, Ralva boasts more health than most endgame fights, though, again, Scadutree blessings make him a little bit less intimidating. On top of that, boasting a high resistance to bleed and frostbite means that there's not really a shortcut around this beast of a health bar. He's not just a defensive threat, too. He does really heavy damage, attacks absolutely relentlessly, especially for a non-remembrance boss, and has a ton of area effects that layer with his melee moves and are fairly reminiscent of the Beast Clergyman. His slams create follow-up shockwaves, slashes shoot wind projectiles forward, and he has AoE explosions at the end of combo strings that the player can jump over if they want to keep up aggression. He also suffers from what at this point is my favorite design concept to mention. He pivots on the ground like he's on a microwave plate instead of moving naturally. His claw strikes can turn him somewhat more smoothly, but it still looks a little janky. On top of that, and the big reason why I don't consider him to be a Rune Bear, Ralva has a second phase. He stands up on his hind legs and enters a rage. Not only does this provide him unique roar attacks that knock the player down, but the entire moveset slightly adjusts here. All of his basic claw strikes gain a wind after effects, making dodges a lot more precise, blocking take more stamina, and shrinking the windows of opportunity that you can counterattack. Outside of Remembrance encounters, the Great Red Bears easily are the most aggressive bosses in Shadow over the Erdtree. There's a lot of boss, enemy, and model reuse that doesn't land as well, but I think the Great Red Bears make for excellent overworld bosses. High health, high damage, and an interesting second phase means that it feels like an evolution of the Rune Bear rather than just a reuse of the enemy. Overall, I think Ralva earns a high B grade, with the occasionally frustrating hitboxes of the Rune Bear still persisting here, and the spinning in place taking away from a lot of the atmosphere. Even with that, the fight is still more solid than not. Dryleaf Dane, like plenty of fights before him, is an NPC with a boss health bar and arena, but he also has the strangest context of any boss in Elden Ring. With everything considered, he feels more like an invasion than a boss fight. That's not to say that makes him feel like a bad boss fight, just that he goes for a very different feel than the rest of the game's encounters. The player begins the fight with Dane by using a gesture next to him, which challenges him to a duel. The player is summoned into an arena version of the same area they were just in, with some walls up, and Dryleaf Dane starts to sprint toward them and attack. Dane uses a new weapon type introduced in the DLC, martial arts. He punches, kicks, and uses weapon arts to close the distance and shoot waves of wind as projectiles. His armor is light enough that the player can often stagger him out of attacks, but he's quick enough that he can roll out between the player's attacks more often than not and get in some small hits himself. Despite this, he doesn't feel like he spams dodge as much as NPCs like Gideon did, because Gideon was constantly rolling around the arena, where Dryleaf does feel a little more intentional. He is more frail than a lot of the Mausoleum NPCs, boasting just over 12,000 hit points and no Estus Flask to heal. Dane is almost always on the offense as well, rushing towards the player or using an art to hurt them from a distance. It keeps the fight from ever losing momentum, and also means he's always able to be punished. Dane is aggressive to a fault, and the player can take advantage of that to find openings, especially once they realize how easy he is to stagger. Unfortunately for Dane, his damage is kinda pathetic. Though he can get some combos that do solid damage, out-damaging Dane is really easy. Dryleaf Dane serves two major roles outside of his boss fight too, each of which have more focus put on them than the fight itself. First, the fight provides the player with the Dryleaf Arts weapon, providing one avenue of access to the new weapon type. And second, Dryleaf Dane is a major part in one of the DLC's final encounters, and knowing how to combo and deal with him from this encounter makes him that much easier to handle in the far more chaotic second appearance. Though he fulfills his role well enough, the big issue is still that he doesn't have much of a personal identity as a boss. He is a solid NPC and he never gets too annoying, but he also doesn't have a moment that makes him feel incredible, and he poses very little actual risk to the player. Because of that, I think he earns a high D grade. Though he technically fulfills his role in the game, he doesn't do anything beyond that to leave a lasting impression. Especially with how fragile he is, the fact he introduces Dane for a later fight is the only thing that gives the battle any real purpose. The final of the trio of Ghostflame dragons, unfortunately, is also the worst of the bunch. He doesn't scale as much as the Cerulean Coast version did, only jumping up by another 2,000 hit points to hit 41,000, which is an amount of hit points that will usually be taken off by the main gimmick that makes this fight fall behind the others, in my opinion. When you find this Ghostflame dragon, he is already in the middle of a fight with an army of mobs. Now, I'm not sure of the exact count because it's a little chaotic, but there are at least 2 Great Hammer Black Knights, 2 Black Knight Archers that can switch to Twin Blades, a horde of regular enemies, and 2 Perfumers, which provide a damage-canceling shield on all the mobs that last for a short time. And this shield is part of the biggest issue here. The way the fight feels like it is intended to work is that you join the fight and it becomes a chaotic free-for-all. You either join in hunting the dragon, often being attacked from behind as you do, or you help clear out the knights. But the knights cannot beat the dragon on their own. Despite the fact that they're easily doing half your health bar with almost every hit, they barely tickle the dragon, even with their holy attacks. And where it gets frustrating is that the dragon's damage against the knights is pathetically low. Even without the Perfumer's shield, the dragon will take ages to wear down any member of the army without direct help. And the army is large enough that sitting and waiting for them to die will take 10, sometimes 15 minutes. That means, in order to get an actual fight with the Ghostflame dragon, which has been my favorite overworld Drake variation thus far, you have to help the dragon by fighting this army, and by the time that is done, your resources end up drawn thin. And on top of that, the entire arena that you face the dragon on afterwards is sloped, with tons of ledges and gaps to fall off or in that disrupt the dragon's move in strange and unnatural ways. Combine that with how long even a single attempt against the dragon often takes, and this fight becomes an absolute chore. Failed attempts against this dragon often took longer than successful attempts against the game's final remembrances. Though the idea of interrupting this fight was amazing in practice, the damage protection of the Perfumers combined with the low damage that the dragon deals to mobs makes the fight drag on for what feels like forever. And the chaos of that many Black Knights, mobs that are already a decent threat in pairs, means that ignoring the army isn't really an option. It feels like every decision that could have been made to make this battle more frustrating than it needed to be was made, and it really hurts this dragon's final showing. I think the Ghostflame dragon here earns a D grade. I still enjoy the dragons as enemies in the DLC. The improvements made and clear weaknesses of the Ghostflames in particular do a great job to make them feel like more than a reskin. But that doesn't mean we needed 3 different versions of the same dragon, especially with 2 of them relying on mechanics that distracted from the dragon's design in irritating ways. The second of the 2 Black Knight battles, Edredd makes use of the Twin Blade moveset. Like Garrew, he similarly adds 1 new move to his arsenal, this time a flying spin with his blades. Unlike Garrew's new move, which provided a new level of engagement to his fight, this new move is fairly similar to his normal major combo, if not a little shorter, meaning it doesn't really shake up the moveset in any big way. With that being said, the biggest thing that helps Edredd shine over Garrew is that he feels properly placed in the world for the kind of boss fight that he is. Matching Garrew's health bar with just under 10,000 hit points, Edredd is located along that optional path into Shadow Altus, which means the player running into him while entering the Altus area is a lot more realistic, and his scaling as a mini-boss works perfectly perfectly there. On top of that, he also wins the award for the boss most capable in the DLC of jump scaring the player. You walk towards a Black Knight, nothing unusual here, until it leaps into the air, grows a health bar, grows wings, starts blasting music, and rushes towards you. Like Garrew, Edredd is not a boss designed for players to be stuck on for too long, and placed in a side path in a dungeon that a large majority of players will move through makes for a much more natural place for the encounter to sit. There's not much else to say. The Black Knights make for decent mini-bosses, and the added spectacle of the new move does help, even if it's not very interesting. I prefer Garrew's moveset as a boss, but I prefer Edredd's world placement, which means I think they both balance each other out in the C grade. Decent mini-boss versions of mobs. Running into a mob with a health bar in the small corners of the overworld may feel underwhelming, but not nearly as underwhelming as running into a mob at the end of a dungeon. Especially considering how much more detail the dungeons in the DLC have, and occasionally how much importance they have, with 2 of them even accessing new areas, going through an entire dungeon only to be greeted by the Curseblade Labirith, the first enemy you saw in the entire DLC, makes for a disappointing encounter. On top of that, the Cursed Blade here is fragile, so much so that the Black Knights are put to shame. The Black Knights didn't quite break 10,000, but at least had a 20% resistance to almost all forms of damages, with only a couple weaknesses. The Cursed Blade is restricted to 8,500 and doesn't have any positive resistances. The end result is that this is a contender for the most fragile boss in the DLC. Both my successful attempts against the boss ended in less than 1 minute, even when I wasn't fully optimized. She just dies so quickly, and even the attempt I failed was entirely because of my own greed, going for a jump attack that missed instead of just healing. She has one big shakeup within the fight, namely that she fills the arena with a shadow that lingers throughout the entire battle. It feels like a callback to the Lost Sinner from Dark Souls 2, and though it looks better, there aren't any real details that make this darkness mechanic feel memorable. I feel Elden Ring's more advanced engine at this point could have really handled light and darkness better and done what the Lost Sinner tried to do back in Dark Souls 2, but all this effectively was a dark room, and not even dark enough to need the lantern. Overall, the Curseblade Labirith earns a D grade, joining the Lamenter at the bottom of the DLC's roster of encounters. It doesn't earn its spot at the end of a dungeon, and ends up making the entire area that it's in feel somewhat pointless. The Golden Hippopotamus, like Rellana, is a boss that most players will end up fighting as they explore the Shadowkeep for the first time, even if the player is able to get around him on later playthroughs on their path towards Messmer. I do love how the DLC puts a big focus on these optional boss fights, especially when they have such big rewards like 2 Scadutree blessings, like the Golden Hippopotamus. It helps justify itself on later playthroughs, while still providing a way around having to face these bosses again. Before I go into the moveset, I have one other thing I do have to mention. It is astonishing that it took us until the DLC of Elden Ring to get a hippopotamus as an enemy. We got plenty of giant animals, but despite hippos being the single most terrifying animal alive, I rarely see them used as a base for a fantasy monster, and the Golden Hippopotamus design feels fantastical enough for Elden Ring, while also, despite everything, being recognizable as a big hairy hippopotamus. The hippopotamus's first phase moveset primarily focuses on slams with its head or bite attacks that allow it to turn and keep its focus on the player, with one huge charge attack that speeds up as it goes across the arena. There are a few things this phase does really well, and a few things that it really doesn't. The first accolade I have to give is that, despite the fact that the hippo is constantly aggressive, making it hard to find any windows, and despite the fact that the long nature of the design means his body has to turn a lot for his moveset to work, the Golden Hippopotamus does not spin. His legs brace before he walks, and the designers made use of the long neck to not have to spin the model every single attack. On the other hand, the slams and headbutts track and close the distance well enough that most melee builds will be fighting the hippopotamus from inside its head, which is not a solid object, since it allows a player to stand inside it and attack the body from the inside. This is likely to avoid the player getting stuck as they roll through the bites and slams, but the end result looks kinda silly. But that comes to another strength. When you're able to roll through those bites and slams, punishing the hippo feels great. The larger hitbox and lack of resistances means that the 34,000 hit points may feel bulky, but in the middle of the DLC ends up serving as somewhat of a blessing check before you enter the Shadowkeep, an area which houses the first of the 4 required boss fights in this DLC. If you have enough blessings to face Messmer, then the Golden Hippopotamus's health bar feels a lot lighter than it would if you reach the Shadowkeep with a low number of blessings. However, high damage can get problematic with messy hitboxes, and though I disagree with the Hippopotamus's greatest haters, the large slam and charge attack are both fairly sloppy. The timing on the slam feels disjointed from the shockwave that the player should jump or roll, and the charge attack is just a mess. It speeds up over time, and it starts moving so slowly and tracks the player well enough that it feels really bad to dodge. The further you get into the charge, the more natural it can feel, but the sloppiness early on in the Hippopotamus's penchant for charging suddenly and without warning hurts this fight a lot. The second phase does escalate the fight nicely without changing much. The slam attack will add a storm of golden quills that do solid damage and keep the player off, while also creating a larger window to punish, and adding a jumping attack that can be rolled and punished, or rolled and healed through without too much trouble. It also looks visually busy, but I never found the new visual update ever disorienting. The camera can struggle in the corner, but despite all this, I think the Golden Hippopotamus is still a decent overall boss, earning a B grade despite the issues with some of his moveset. Learning how to take him down is really satisfying, and despite being in the realm of mini-bosses, he has enough presence that he does sit along bosses like the Red Wolf of Radagon fairly well. The third of the 4 Mausoleum fights, the Rakshasa finally gets some of the scaling the Dancer of Ranah needed to pose more of a threat. Boasting heavy armor and a great katana, the Rakshasa can cover a lot of space with her attacks, and though her stance isn't quite as hard to break as the Knight of the Solitary Jail, once the Rakshasa begins attacking, it becomes very hard to find a window to push in among the lunges and double slash combos. Boasting 20,000 hit points and an Estus flask that looks like it heals somewhere around 5,000, Rakshasa has enough heft to last, which makes the low health totals of the Black Knights and the Curseblade continually strange. As hard as it often is to get in, there is a satisfying predictability to the Rakshas's attacks that I think helps set them above some of the less satisfying NPCs. Now this next point might be fully personal, but I did see the name Rakshasa before I learned who the boss would be, and Rakshasas are some of my favorite mythological creatures. Considering most Elden Ring designs lean more Western in terms of overall design, taking a lot of inspiration from European fantasy, I was really excited to see From Software's interpretation of this mythological demon. But instead we got a lady in cool armor wielding a very anime sword. I realize that this fully comes down to my own expectations, but even though I like Rakshasa, I want to make it clear that though the fight is alright, I would much rather be fighting a Rakshasa rather than a murderer named after a monster that we've never seen. Rakshasa earns a C grade, being a decent NPC design that's satisfying to break in on, even if she also makes me really want another boss fight that we just didn't get. In the Bonny Village, found dropping through the Morth runes, is a withered tree with a headless statue. Loot this statue and the player will learn the Oh Mother gesture. Then, after draining the courtyard in the Shadowkeep and heading down to the bottom of the area, the player will find a statue of Marigga. And should they perform a gesture in front of this statue, it will move to the side, revealing the Hinterlands, an area filled with uncharacteristic color and life. And as a reward for finding this exceptionally hidden area, the player comes face to face with a hidden boss fight, the Tree Sentinels. Again, the Tree Sentinels still make for a good fight. In some ways, I prefer the setup here to in the Royal Capital. The torch-wielding Sentinel arrives first as the shield-wearer slowly continues up the path. The player is often in no rush, and though I was able to find footage of people fighting both, these battles usually end up on 2 one-on-one battles rather than a duo fight, which partially cements my thought that the Royal Capital Sentinels were designed to be fought one at a time. However, though you don't receive runes until both are dead, you do receive a Blessing of Marigga, and the first Sentinel stays permanently dead once you beat it. So it's also not really a true duo fight, rather than just 2 adjacent boss fights that share a rune pool for some reason. The health here is also surprisingly low, with the first Sentinel sitting at 20,500 hit points, and the second having a little more with 24,500. The Tree Sentinels are really fun opponents, and with the enemy given the space it needs to excel, both the fights show off the best part about the enemies in a way that the Royal Capital duo just doesn't. But at the same time, the fact you don't have to restart the gauntlet if you beat the first Sentinel, combined with such a common boss being the reward for finding this very well hidden area, means this boss lacks the identity that the Limgrave and Draconic variations did. I still think this set of Tree Sentinels earns a B grade, though most of that is carried by how great the enemy type is to begin with, rather than being an ideal reuse of the enemy. And though I gave the Tree Sentinels some grace as repeated main bosses hidden in the hinterlands, that is not a grace I will be giving the Fallingstar Beast, because this Fallingstar Beast has nothing interesting to say. There's no new type of arena, no unique item to be earned. You walk past the Tree Sentinels and immediately after there is another reused boss fight, this time against far less satisfying Fallingstar Beasts. This boss fight comes so quickly after the Tree Sentinels that there isn't even another grace. It ends up being Tree Sentinel, Fallingstar Beast if you don't sit down and rest. And there's just not enough space in this area for two boss fights, with the Tree Sentinel being the better of the two just because Tree Sentinels carry a little more weight in Elden Ring. That means that the Fallingstar Beast is the subject of today's ire. Though it doesn't have much more health on paper than the second of the Tree Sentinels, the Fallingstar Beast's 26,000 hit points is protected by the creature's continued massive resistance to all damage type, 35% to all physical, 20% to all elemental types, plus a continued immunity to bleed and frost. Though the moveset does work better with the slightly less extreme slopes of the area and outdoor nature of the battle, the fight feels unimportant and easily missable. The three Fallingstar Beasts in the main game increased in scale to the full-grown Fallingstar Beast. However you view the boss overall, it's impossible not to acknowledge that there was a sense of growth leading to that final battle on top of the mountain. Having an endgame scaled beast ends up ignoring one of the things that the original boss did well. That's not to say I wanted a full-grown Fallingstar Beast here, I just don't think this boss should exist in the first place. On your way to unlock the boss fight against Lamenter, you need to reach the two finger ruins, the second of which is in the hinterlands. It's the big thing hidden there. Rather than letting that cold and grey area contrast against the color of the hinterlands on its own, the game decides to put another crater down with the Fallingstar Beast. Maybe to foreshadow that the next area is also a crater, but the end result is just that the gorgeous landscape of the hinterlands is already shown to be imperfect before the Finger Ruins takes that beauty away. To me, it lessens the impact finding the Finger Ruins could have otherwise had by introducing the cold environment too early. The Finger Ruins already weren't great areas, but at least this one would have had something going on with it if the Fallingstar Beast hadn't tried and failed to build towards it from its location on the side of the road. I think this Fallingstar Beast earns a D grade, and though I do prefer fighting an actual boss to Lamenter and Curseblade Labirith, the Fallingstar Beast earns my number 3 spot for bosses I wish I could cut from the DLC. Number 1 and 2 are still yet to come in this video, worry not. We have almost reached a run of 5 Remembrance bosses that rest in Shadow Altus, but before we do, there's one more boss that we have to discuss first. The only required standard boss in a DLC Remembrance run, blocking access to the Abyssal Woods, and the boss that lies behind it, is Jori, Elder Inquisitor. Jori often gets pretty disliked by the community. Instead of the usual melee moveset, Jori relies on summons, spells, and teleporting away in order to face the player. Personally though, I think Jori works as a pretty decent change of pace, even with the occasional frustration that they present. Jori has a decent collection of moves, all of which focus on trying to keep the player away. She can send a Rune Arc as a wave that can be rolled or jumped, release a wave of smaller attacks that shoot out in somewhat unpredictable patterns, or summon columns of light that burst out of the ground 9 times, being interrupted if she's hit or backstabbed. She also has one melee combo, but that doesn't pose much of a risk and rarely comes out. Once the player has pushed into melee, she'll often teleport away with a damaging burst, and then summon illusionary Inquisitors to help her. Jori either summons 2 smaller Inquisitors, 1 larger Inquisitor, or all 3 at once, and all of these enemies will utilize their standard moveset. I'm not sure if this is just luck, but the 2 Inquisitors do always seem to select the same attack, whether it be the Fire Breath, the Rune Arc Wave, or trying to use their icons as daggers. The large Inquisitor is often the more disruptive summon, using a huge slam, spinning towards the player, or a selection of other large area attacks. Jori, of course, also keeps attacking throughout this whole process, which can be overwhelming and put the players in scenarios where it's often hard to press back in. The illusions will fade with time, or they can be destroyed with a single hit of damage, and the player is able to get some damage on Jori before she teleports back away and begins the whole cycle again. The fight ends up reminiscent of battles like Fool's Idol or Crystal Sage, except with less focus on finding what you need to damage and more on making reaching Jori challenging. Jori is a lot more durable than most non-remembrance bosses, boasting 30,500 hit points, though a lack of resistances and being a gateway to one of the final zones of the DLC means that she doesn't feel absurdly durable. It's also possible to backstab chain her, carving your way through her health bar with minimal risk, though her teleportation can also extend that health bar pretty significantly. The biggest criticism levied against Jori is that her attacks end up stalling out the player and becoming frustrating, and though to some extent they do, I prefer her to a lot of the other illusion or summon focused fights within the series. Placed this deep in the DLC, her damage never has the potential to be as overwhelming as foes like the Crystal Sage could when they were fought early, and the enemies she summons are much more engaging than things like the Fool's Idol zombies. Though the attacks can get hectic, being able to backstab Jori for invulnerability frames to avoid the illusions is also ridiculously satisfying, and the more limited moveset is wide enough to feel diverse while also being easy to understand quickly. Overall, I think Jori earns a B grade. I enjoy the mechanics more than I dislike the frustrations, and I think she's a decent boss for the player to be forced to fight through on their way to the Abyssal Woods, an area that I'll discuss more when we get to a later encounter. Beginning Shadow Altus' set of remembrances is going to be Commander Gaius, a callback to the two commander bosses from the base game, but instead of with a prosthetic leg, Gaius has no legs and instead rides on an armored boar. Now before I get into anything else, I have to talk about the worst part of this boss fight by a pretty massive margin. Gaius' charge is another contender for the single worst attack in the game. There are moves that disrupt their fight more, like the waterfowl dance, but often when people yell about hitboxes, things aren't as unnatural as they seem in the extreme circumstances. But in this fight, the hitboxes are just horrible. It took me plenty of attempts to beat Gaius the first time, and the attack has a ridiculously tight dodge window and can do anywhere between no damage, a quarter of your health, half your health, or 80% of your health. Blocking it makes it more reliable, but you shouldn't have to use a shield to not have to deal with messy hitboxes. He always opens with this move too, although the fact that he was moved to start further back in the arena does make it a lot easier to try and dodge the roll, or at least prepare for it, rather than when he starts already halfway towards the player in the middle of a charge. He can pull the charge back out occasionally throughout the fight, and it never becomes fun to dodge, but it's also fairly rare to see it come out. The fact that there are cases where the attack does almost 80% of your health, though, makes it feel really sloppy and holds this fight back a ton. But the rest of the moveset works really well. In addition to a slam, back kick from the board, a spin, and a collection of stabs with his spear or tusk strikes from the mount, Gaius has one major combo string that combines his and the boar's aggression into follow-up hits. Though it feels overwhelming at first, it puts a really satisfying emphasis on positioning and spacing without being as complicated as a lot of similar combos, and also leaves a large window afterwards to punish. Leaving punish windows for the player is something Gaius does really well. He feels incredibly mobile on his boar, but the impact of every attack roots him in place for a moment, which means being in the right spot to punish him feels like skill rather than random chance. He also dabbles in some gravity magic, creating larger than usual melee strikes or AoE effects in the first phase. Once around half of his fairly hefty 34,000 hit points have been removed, he enters his second phase. And I know I just said 30,000 hit points wasn't much for Jori, but Gaius has more resistances and doesn't set himself up to be combo food as much as Jori often does. Within his second phase, the moveset here stays mostly the same, just unlocking some gravity attacks. He always opens the phase with a leap into the air that comes crashing onto the player. The dodging is precise and more reliable to learn, but it doesn't utilize an animation trick that a later boss introduces to make this kind of move work really smoothly. On top of this, he can summon tracking rocks that serve as a much more interesting move for him to close distance with than his charge, and he can create a small black hole that will pull the player towards it until it eventually explodes. I really love how the black hole forces the player to constantly be on the move, and though the player being moved is always a little nerve-wracking, I never felt like I had lost control of my character. Outside of the charge, the biggest issue with Gaius doesn't even come from Gaius himself, but is a fault on another of the game's subsystems, Torrent. Now, there have been plenty of comments and other discussions about it, but combat on Torrent, outside of simple mobility, is just not great. Gaius is one of the only remembrances that actually allows Torrent, and where Radahn was built around it and the Elden Beast demands mobility, Gaius is constantly in the player's face, making Torrent somewhat of a trap rather than the boon that it feels like the game wanted him to be. Though Gaius is easy to malign for his sloppy charge, over my 2 playthroughs, he became one of my favorite bosses to learn how to face. And as it's clicked into place, he's just become such a satisfying foe. I think he still earns an A grade with that charge attack and lack of any real atmosphere outside of your standard Elden Ring fare, holding him back from any higher honors. Most remembrances in the DLC are hefty creatures, but the Scadutree Avatar is comparatively frail. The Avatar is built around a weak spot on his face, where he takes 50% additional damage, and he adds another layer to the trope by also adding a 60% resistance to attacks targeted at his stem. He has a really interesting moveset that focuses on creating numerous after effects, but set at the end of the DLC without any content or upgrades behind him, the Avatar's measly 7,500 hit points means he'll be down quickly. And then he'll get back up with 9,500 hit points, 13,500 if you didn't repost him at the end of the previous phase, and he'll make you the whole boss fight 2 more times. And it'll grow in complexity each time he resurrects. Now his health still ends up pretty low compared to the other remembrances at this point. A combined 27,000, especially with a 50% weakness, is really fragile for this late in the DLC. Out of the 10 remembrance bosses, the Scadutree Avatar is the boss I think I know the least, namely because he's the only remembrance I didn't die to on either of my runs. Though his attacks are threatening, trading against him my first playthrough worked well enough to get me through it. And though his increased health and the fact that guard countering doesn't often work meant my sword and shield build worked a lot less effectively, I still ended up being able to trade my way through rather than needing to really learn and analyze the fight like I did for every other remembrance in the DLC. The Avatar's moveset is hard to describe. There are slams and spins, most of which leave the Avatar's head low to the ground. Certain slams leave thorns on the ground that deal chip damage and inflict bleed, and have an explosive effect that can be jumped over. Though it probably takes more than my 2 attempts to really learn how to avoid the thorns, the damage on them is still pretty low, all things considered. There's also a grab, which slams the face onto the player, as well as 2 AoEs. One that's unlocked partway through the first phase, where the Avatar creates tracking projectiles that hone in on the player. The other is a huge burst that can be precisely dodged through or tanked, and also leaves a huge window afterwards to punish the Avatar or heal back up. There's a triple charge that does require some precise dodge timing, but it has a very satisfying Vort-esque rhythm to it. It all works, it all feels okay, but it doesn't feel quite as demanding or precise as the best Elden Ring remembrances. Despite having beaten him twice, I still feel like I haven't learned the fight, but I still came out on top both times despite having 3 whole health bars to work through. It's not a bad fight, and the visual design works really well here, but it's still a really strange one. Outside of the remembrance, the only thing that it provides the player is Miquella's Great Root, which has a very niche purpose in the final boss fight of the DLC, one that at least the people I've personally seen play the DLC just haven't used. The end result here is a boss designed to be a final challenge that doesn't really stand among the rest of those final challenges. I do think there's more good than bad in the Scadutree Avatar. The arena looks great and the music is astonishing. The multiple health bars create a great sense of not knowing how much longer you actually have to go on your first attempt, and the addition of that easy to punish AoE in the third phase does really help to create that feeling of progression in what's otherwise a fairly repetitive fight. I also really love the Erdtree Avatar finally evolving into a new kind of fight. In the base game, where the avatars never try to become anything more, the Shadowtree's avatar design really pushes the concept to the limit. This black, wilted sunflower come to life at the base of the tree makes for an incredible design. Overall, I'd give it a B grade, sitting around the same place as bosses like the Fire Giant. There are some aspects that work really well, but it lacks a lot of the presentation and satisfaction that Elden Ring excels at. Despite being minorly disappointed in the Scadutree Avatar, I think almost every single remembrance in Shadow of the Erdtree ends up a highlight of the game. Up until this point, the lowest grade I've given a remembrance in Elden Ring at all is a C grade. Though Elden Ring has bosses that feel aimless or underwhelming, the main roster of battles is exceptional. But there is one remembrance, however, that I think deserves a below average grade, and anyone who's played the DLC probably knows that it is Metter, Mother of Fingers. There's a ton of build-up to Metter that tries to build towards a massive atmosphere. You have to find Count Ymir, traverse and find 2 different finger runes, each of which are well hidden, then deal with NPC invasions as you're exploring the manor, which gives you access to the boss. The music is surreal, it takes concepts from Estelle and dials them up to 11. And the design of Metyr is a decent evolution of the giant hands found in the rest of the game. You can tell they're connected, and Metyr is clearly the pinnacle of it. The huge fingerprint that makes up her face, the fingers that grow from the side of her body, the 2 fingers that curl from her back as a source of magic. The design is good, it's uncanny, but it doesn't feel like you're gazing into the eldritch or unknown like Estelle, while also not being as epic or dramatic as bosses like Midra. It feels like it's kind of in a nowhere zone, where it's a strange design, but it just doesn't land anywhere. To make it worse, the fight itself is a bit of a mess. Meteor is the tankiest remembrance up to this point, boasting 43,000 hit points and decent resistances to anything but slashing damage, which definitely helped a lot of my first playthrough. Some of her attacks are perfectly serviceable. Slams with her face and forward arms, pulling the fingers on her side in and then bursting them out in a quick attack, the leaping slams, or this laser from her face that bursts forward or gets dragged across the arena in an arc. She can create AoEs that the player has to find gaps within, or create small hands that chase after the player. The biggest fumble in the first phase is her crawling attack, which punishes players standing to her side as she moves about twice the length of her body towards the player as a big sentient hitbox. If you were attacking, you can't roll through this move, you're just gonna get hit. But where the fight really falls apart for me is her second phase. She generates a black hole with a huge AoE that, even running straight away from her, has to be perfectly rolled through. She can generate explosive orbs from the ground at this point, her laser starts to shoot in sets of 3. Neither of those attacks are too bad, but she gets 2 more attacks that both miss the mark. She can rise into the air and start spinning, which can be precisely rolled through, or much more reliably spaced out, which works but doesn't ever feel very exciting. The biggest problem, and the reason that I'm just not going to bother with this fight when my Rune level 1 playthrough reaches it, is the tail laser. She flies into the air and starts a damaging pulse that demands the player be a certain distance away. She creates 2 lasers that then spin around her, hitting the ground a variable distance away from her and pushing damage out from there. Now, this attack isn't lethal if you're high level, but it is very inconsistent. The goal is to stand between the bursting damage from Meteor and the laser, but the edge of the bursting damage is indistinct, and the laser sometimes feels like it has no intention of hurting the player, and other times feels like there is no space to dodge. On top of that, there is no real window to punish her afterwards. At the end of the battle, a black hole appears and Meteor vanishes into it. You get the remembrance and runes, and you're pushed into a smaller boss fight. It's a really strange ending to the battle. Considering her health, Meteor feels scaled to be one of the final DLC bosses, but then follows it immediately after with a mini-boss. It lacks the same level of impact and scale that the defeat of other large side quest bosses like Midra or Bayle that are scaled this late into the game have. Meteor earns a D grade. She is my least favorite remembrance in Elden Ring, and the fight really fails to deliver on most of what it sets out to do, but it still works well enough that I don't think it's near an F grade boss, despite the fact I don't have much of a desire to ever worry about her again. And once you beat Meteor, the player is pushed into an NPC battle with Sword Hand Knight Jalan, which doesn't take long to burst through, especially if the player was correctly scaled for Meteor. After she dies, Count Ymir appears, now with the moniker Mother of Fingers, and serves as another NPC with a boss health bar. Ymir's moveset is extremely strange, and the fight as a whole feels incredibly finicky. There are 3 core moves: summoning small hands to join the fight, summoning these fingers that force the player to get away, and summoning tracking projectiles that do hone in on the player well enough to need to be rolled, but not well enough to need to worry about rolling after the first dodge. On top of that, he himself teleports around the arena pretty frequently, and on my first playthrough, he even decided to teleport outside of the arena and kill himself after I finally found where in the wall that he'd moved to. And even if he doesn't kill himself though, despite teleporting around a lot, Ymir poses no actual risk to the player. His damage is really low, and he's not nearly aggressive enough to be any kind of concern to someone who is just able to beat Meteor. With just over 11,000 hit points, and not even the Estus that other NPC fights with more durability used, Ymir ends up being often the final NPC most players will find, while also being the easiest of all the DLC's NPC fights. The encounter wants to lean on its atmosphere, but that atmosphere never quite landed with me. Ymir relies on what Meteor just set up, and Meteor's sloppier moves take your mind away from the atmosphere, and then Ymir ends up trying to rely on something that just wasn't successfully built. Count Ymir, Mother of Fingers, earns a D grade. There is enough design to save it from the F grade, but it's a violently boring NPC battle that serves as a nail in the coffin for the disappointing Meteor questline. And with only 13 bosses left in the DLC, we finally reach our first required battle, Messmer the Impaler. Messmer was the advertised baddie of the DLC and boasts one of those 4 introductory cutscenes among the roster of major battles, and one of only 2 transition cutscenes in the DLC. Messmer's cutscenes to me have always been the most underwhelming part of his otherwise stellar encounter. When the player enters the dark arena, watching its candles light around them, Messmer's voice breaks the silence, and as the player turns away from Messmer for some untold reason, they turn back to be jump-scared by a snake. Messmer rises, gets the usual slow reveal of portions of his body, and then says his big tagline while he makes a cool pose. It works decently, but outside of the shock of the snake showing up, it lacked the impact of the best cutscenes in Elden Ring. It also runs a little long. This whole cutscene is 1 minute and 15 seconds, which, for a man standing up and walking towards you, is a long time. With that said, though I'm not a huge fan of the cutscene, the fight is another matter entirely. Messmer's moveset is beyond exceptional. Huge, fiery explosions that rise into the air and crash down. His spear combos are incredible as Messmer flips, flies, and lunges around the arena, really using the range of the spear to his advantage. He often creates explosions at the end of his combos, all of which can be perfectly rolled through in order to punish him, or he has a few pyromancy spells that can extend his range artificially for a few moments. Though many of his attacks, like his grab and his dragging spear attack, do utilize delays, there's still an incredible feeling rhythm to this fight. He has enough health that the player is encouraged to sit at least over 10 blessing levels. With 39,000 hit points, a blessing of 10 or 11 brings his health overall in line with other endgame foes like Godfrey. And despite Messmer's insane aggression, he is also one of the most punishable bosses in the DLC's entire roster. He rarely fakes out at the end of his combos, meaning that once you learn how to roll into the explosions, the player often finds themselves able to take advantage of almost everything that Messmer does. He still feels challenging, but there is a great feeling of back and forth to this fight. Once the player's learned it, it feels like you are locked in combat, blade against blade at every single moment, with Messmer leaving enough openings that you'll never go long without an opportunity to counter yourself. Even his most elaborate combo leaves another huge opening in a way that a lot of other showy moves in the DLC don't. Once he reaches half health, he has another cutscene. Though I prefer this one to the first in terms of cinematography, it has two problems. First, it is another really long cutscene, sitting at about 1 minute and 45 seconds, 7 seconds of which are just a pure black screen. Messmer insults you, stares at a statue of his mother, begs her forgiveness, and plucks his own eye out of his head. He then crushes it in his fingers and rises, his tunic burning away and the snake changing color as he reveals the abyssal serpent inside his body. He becomes at this point Base Serpent Messmer, and his moveset adjusts accordingly. The biggest issue is that Messmer suffers probably the worst of all bosses from a trope that a lot of Elden Ring cutscenes suffer from. The boss is doing something very dramatic in order to power up, and the Tarnished is canonically staring dramatically from off-screen without preparing or doing anything about what's going on. That entire trope's always taken me a little out of the moment, and usually I can try to forget it, but you really feel it in this cutscene when Messmer is very methodically pulling his eye out of his head. A lot of Messmer's shorter attack strings vanish here, or at least given far lower priority by his AI. The rest of his moveset, however, stays the same, with a collection of new moves entering the mix. He gets a charge that rushes across the arena quickly, and also gains the ability to become and to summon giant snakes. His explosion shifts, he can teleport onto the player and seek them out, he can turn into a snake that attacks 3 times, he can create a storm of snakes that rush the players from all directions, but even that rushdown ends with Messmer doing that familiar leap into an explosion that leaves him open once you've learned how to punish it. There is a clarity in the player's opportunities to strike even in the most chaotic moves in this moveset, and I adore Messmer for that. There is no moment in the Messmer encounter where a player usually thinks, when am I supposed to attack, or how am I supposed to beat this? Messmer, since he leaves so many windows, always feels attainable, even at his most powerful. He is a hard boss, don't get me wrong, he took me over 20 attempts on my first go-around, but the moveset ends up reminding me a lot of Gaol. He is a huge wall, he does a lot of damage, but you know that there are gaps. You can see them. You just need to learn how to survive long enough to press your advantage. There was no moment once I found Messmer I wanted to leave. Every attempt that ended, I was immediately ready to leap right back into the fray. Though the cutscenes have always felt disappointing to me, feeling very standard Elden Ring rather than anything unique, every other piece of the fight is so masterfully executed that the scenes don't hold back the fight for me at all. Messmer also takes the summoning mechanic introduced in Fire Giant and escalates escalates it. Messmer is one of 2 encounters in the DLC that are built around a summonable NPC who can be found inside the arena that doesn't increase his scaling. Out of 2 encounters, though, I don't think Messmer does as well. The player can summon Hornsent, which removes him from a later battle, or Jolan, who I have to admit I've never actually summoned here. Hornsent has plenty to say during the fight, but Messmer as a boss doesn't actually work as well with summons in my opinion. His moveset moves him around a lot, but always ends him near the player that he's attacking. When he's flying away from the player, the fight loses that momentum, that constant feeling of clashing that makes Messmer feel so good. With all things said and done though, the gameplay and atmosphere carry this fight. Though the cutscenes aren't my favorite, and Messmer's place as one of the 2 bosses who summons inside their arena in the DLC always felt strange to me, the fight is still incredible, and immediately rose to the top of my DLC list, even starting to fight against the best of the best from the base game for that top spot. Even writing this section and rewatching this footage, I wanted to fight him again. He's just that much fun. Messmer easily earned the DLC's first S grade for me. I adore this battle with every fiber of my being, and honestly, I think he earns a spot above my favorite boss battles in Elden Ring's base game. Though, of course, recency bias might also have a say in that. I mentioned when discussing Garrew that there were 2 bosses in the ancient ruins of Ruah that I wasn't able to find on my own. One of those 2 bosses I knew would be an NPC, I just couldn't figure out how to get to him, with that encounter being Red Bear, the last of the mausoleums. Not to be confused with either of the Great Red Bears, Red Bear focuses on quick claw attacks, jump attacks, and a weapon art that creates the same kind of shockwave that the Great Red Bear's attacks do on a single strike, which is far less intimidating than the larger boss. The biggest issue here is that Red Bear feels way too frail for how late into the DLC he's found. He is less than the Rakshasa with only 16,000 hit points, and the player is likely well equipped by the time they found him. Red Bear ends up feeling more frail than even the first of the mausoleum battles. He's not a bad NPC, again, he works perfectly fine, especially if you make sure to get him before you do the bulk of Shadow Altus, but he doesn't do anything to stand out. The location of the mausoleums to me were their biggest issue. All of the DLC takes place in the endgame, but some of these fights feel like more of an endgame challenge than the others, and Red Bear feels like he belongs in the first mausoleum, rather than what's balanced to be one of the last ones that the player encounters. Going off this boss order, this is the last one-on-one NPC battle, even though practically Count Ymir is who most people run into last, and Red Bear just doesn't carry the same kind of weight that the others do. I think Red Bear just barely earns a C grade. He's serviceable as an encounter, but is definitely the least inspired of the 4 mausoleum fights. After facing down one Great Red Bear and a man dressed as a Great Red Bear, we have one more Great Red Bear to face down before the DLC is over. But this one actually is a Great Red Bear, it's not just a dude. One of the only fully repeated bosses in the DLC, Rugalea, the Great Red Bear, is completely identical to Ralva, only found much later in the DLC's progression. However, despite the fact that Ralva is found in the center of Shadow Altus and Rugalea is found at the far back of the ancient ruins, Rugalea doesn't really scale very much. Ralva only had 29,500 hit points, but Rugalea has 30,500. That 1,000 hit points isn't much. In Shadow Altus, the Great Red Bear felt like an absolute beast, higher health than most non-remembrances, and the danger to match. Rugalea just doesn't pose the same level of threat, and it holds him back compared to Ralva. With that said, the Great Red Bear moveset still works pretty well. Rugalea is still a great non-remembrance boss, I just wish that they had a little higher health and damage. The Ancient Ruins scaling is bizarre, and I think part of that comes from the fact that the Ancient Ruins is really 2 areas, a lower area and an upper area, where the lower area ties directly into the plains, where the upper area is the actual endgame zone. Most of the bosses, of course, rest in the lower area, with only 2 resting up above. I wish all of the ruins had scaled up higher to be definitively after the Shadow Keep to be a fully endgame region, but instead we end up with weird fights like this. Rugalea still earns a B grade, though I think he needed to be scaled up. That's more of a fault of the ancient ruins than of the boss itself, even though it hurts Rugalea a lot in the overall ranking. Though another Death Knight in the ruins may technically be a reappearance, the knight uses a halberd here instead of the twin axes, giving it a unique enough moveset that it still manages to feel like a fresh battle. It suffers from the same problem almost all of the ruins suffer from, though, with barely 12,000 hit points to his name. Sure, it's possible for him to heal a massive amount via his grab attack, but without that health, this Death Knight just feels too fragile. The moveset, however, continues to be extraordinary. I do prefer the twin axes, but the halberd still works really well here. The basic moveset is satisfying and rhythmic, and though there are more delayed attacks on the halberd, none are delayed enough to ever feel unnatural. There's also enough similarity between the movesets that it never feels unfamiliar to the player, while still allowing the two fights to maintain their own individuality. The one abnormal piece is that I've always found the halberd moveset to be the easier one to avoid, especially the charge attacks. The axes perform a series of spins that close the distance and require multiple rolls with specific timing and directionality, whereas the halberd just requires one roll. The only thing holding back this Death Knight is the same thing holding back Red Bear and Rugalea. The scaling in the Ancient Runes is really weird. It feels balanced for really early in the DLC, which is somewhat of a problem I think Shadow of the Erdtree has. Almost all the smaller bosses feel like they're in the first half of the DLC, and all the remembrances are backloaded. Obviously, the remembrances being last are perfectly fine, but even bosses that very clearly should happen after a remembrance still feel frail compared to those remembrances. You could easily see this Death Knight having a couple thousand more hit points and just having the Ancient Ruins be a later area, but it doesn't deliver on that. It doesn't try to. I think this Death Knight does still earn an A grade, even if it rests on the lower side of the grade. Even with the Death Knight having room for improvement via more health or swapping moveset locations so that the more complicated axes are introduced afterwards, it remains an exceptional enemy design. And as we enter the final bosses of the DLC, we finally reach the 200th boss in my Elden Ring analysis, the Divine Beast Dancing Lion Blighted rematch. And despite being the boss that holds the honorific of number 200 in this analysis, and though the DLC overall had a much higher overall quality of bosses than the base game, this beast is my pick for the single most worthless boss in Elden Ring. This is the final of the three bosses that I needed help finding. It is very well hidden, and when the player finds it, they're rewarded with an unnecessary rematch with the game's first remembrance, scaled for later in the DLC. However, due to how DLC scaling works, the player's build won't have shifted at all, their numbers have just increased. Sometimes rematching enemies can be interesting as your build improves throughout the game, and as great as the DLC is, the nature of the blessing design means that those kind of rematches feel purposeless. The player will always look fairly similar at the start and end of the DLC, just with bigger numbers. Numerically, the lion scales by about 50%, now resting at 32,000 hit points. On top of that, the arena and atmosphere here are both significantly worse than in the first battle. The lion is wandering around a ruin on a small island with pillars that serve no purpose in the fight outside of causing camera issues, and the lion just wandering around randomly doesn't come anywhere near the drama of the first lion being awoken by a prayer. The first phase mechanically is identical and doesn't make me upset. What makes me upset is the change to the second phase. This Divine Beast adds a new element, Death Blight. Breath attacks and after effects no longer deal damage, but instead leave clouds that build up the death condition. That on its own isn't too bad. In fact, I think that change can work pretty well, as it pushes the player towards dodging in unique ways, since each attack now lingers. The problem is that the lion also summons 4 basilisks that jump around the arena and also spread Death Blight. Their attacks will not coordinate with the lion's attacks, and the player has to chase them down and kill them, with instant death being the penalty for failing to do so. And of course, the big problem that presents is that the dancing lion is the dancing lion. Though I will still defend the camera on the first lion everywhere but against a wall, the lion is definitely not meant to be fought with a group of enemies. The erratic movements force the player to keep constant focus on the lion, with the unique attack timing demanding attention. The lion is huge, closes the distance in an instant, which means it's difficult to escape and fight the basilisks without the lion being right behind you. On top of that, basilisks in general really struggle in this arena. I had a really hard time making them out against the Black of the Stone and the Death Clouds, and if the lion switches elements too quickly, the player ends up spending more time trying to get rid of mobs in order to fight the lion than they do fighting the lion itself. Everything that made the lion work ends up abandoned with this design choice. On my second playthrough, this was the only boss in the entire DLC that, after dying once, I just skipped. I couldn't be bothered to do it again. I imagine the basilisks are likely there because during the first couple tests, people would just ignore the death blight because the phase would be over, and they could let the death blight naturally decrease rather than needing to actually fear it at all. And that was a band-aid solution to make the death blight intimidating again, but that feels like a lazy one. I mentioned with the Fallingstar Beast that it was the number 3 boss that I think shouldn't be in the DLC. The second Divine Beast Dancing Lion earns that number 1 spot. Now I realize the number 2 spot, being the last one in the video, isn't great for retention, but this lion's sloppy design earns him an F grade, and the title of the worst boss in the DLC, as he ruins the wonder of a Remembrance boss, serves as a disappointing hidden opponent, and fails to be an entertaining or atmospheric battle. Similarly, this might be recency bias, but I think that this Dancing Lion fails even more than the Valiant Gargoyles, taking their spot at the bottom of my list. Out of 42 boss encounters in the DLC, only 4 of them are actually required. Messmer is the main boss of the region, and the final boss is split into 2 encounters, one to finalize the NPC stories, and another that brings the DLC to a close. Now the final of the required encounters is also the odd one out, Ranah, Saint of the Bud. I had a hard time figuring out where to start talking about Ranah, so I ended up running an experiment on my friends to check something. I showed 5 of my friends who hadn't played the Elden Ring DLC footage of 9 DLC bosses in alphabetical order. Those bosses being Bayle, Commander Gaius, the Dancing Lion, Midra, Matir, Puterscent Knight, Scadutree Avatar, Rellana, and Ranah. Then I told them only one boss fight that they just watched was actually required to complete the DLC, and had them guess who they thought was the required boss. The results were fairly interesting, and I figured I'd share them in this section here. My wife has the most From Software experience of this group of test subjects, having played Dark Souls, Dark Souls 3, Demon Souls, and the first half of Elden Ring. She guessed the Divine Lion first due to the cutscene and the fact that she'd seen the boss in a lot of clips, then Rellana because she felt too detailed to be optional. Her final vote was Midra, mostly due to his cutscene and striking design, and even mentioned that she had originally not guessed Midra because he felt too important and she thought I was trying to trick her. She was caught very off guard when I mentioned that Ranah was actually the required boss, because though the design was one of her favorites, Ranah felt so straightforward compared to the large-scale fights on the rest of the playlist. She also decided Shadow View is pronounced Scabadaba View, and that Gaius flying into the air is the best part of the DLC. My brother, who doesn't personally vibe with Souls-like, but has plenty of friends who play them, guessed the Scadutree Avatar first, because it's the shadow of the Erdtree, and it's a shadowy tree in the shadow of what he assumed would be an Erdtree. He guessed Rellana next, guessing that the player would collect one of the elements she wielded to unlock or destroy something in the world or fight another boss. Though of course that's wrong, that theory is bizarrely close to Messmer's role in the DLC. Finally, he danced between Gaius and actually brought up Ranah as the potential required boss, both because they felt like they were guarding something. Neither felt important, but he thought they were blocking access to something that was important. He ended up going with Gaius because pigs are funnier than bugs. My dad, who knows absolutely nothing about Souls-like, guessed Midra first. There was a sense of finality and scale provided by the cutscene and moveset that made Midra feel more important than the rest of the list. After that, he guessed the Dancing Lion, again due to the cutscene and music feeling much larger scale, and then ended his trio of guesses with Rellana, because she looked like one of the most intense bosses on the list. A friend of mine who usually plays more story-driven RPGs guessed Midra first, referring to the cutscene, clearly important lore that he was involved with, and unique and escalating moveset throughout his fight. Afterwards, she guessed the Puterscent Knight, since the hidden nature of the fight with that long drop carried some of that cutscene-esque weight for her, and the big moves that Puterscent felt like the most complicated to her just watching the footage, especially when the knight split in half to attack from 2 directions or forced the player to jump over fire in the second phase, plus that laser-focused theme on death and decay felt very Dark Souls. Her final guess was the Scadutree Avatar, for the same reasons as my brother. When I told her it was Ranah, like my wife, she was pretty shocked. Ranah was almost at the bottom of her list because she felt so gameplay focused compared to the other fights. There wasn't as much spectacle or flair as the other fights in the playlist. She also gave the only negative vote, saying that she hoped Meteor wasn't required because she hated the design and watching the fight and assumed From Software was better than that. My final friend, who doesn't often play video games but does know of From Software and all the memes surrounding it, was the only one who guessed correctly. And I just wanted to read some of his messages out. God, I love being in a control group. What kind of crack is Miyazaki smoking to come up with a Centiscorpion? I feel like the Sand of the Bud would be too obvious, so I want to say Rellana. When I asked why Ramina would be obvious, I received Sand of the Bud, the name is Erdtree, figured buds come from trees, plants. I didn't do well in natural sciences, I mostly drew leaves with crayon in a notebook. When I told him that Ramina was right and Rellana was wrong, he told me, see, my thinking was these games always got a fast lady with 2 swords, and I was like, aha! Major boss fights in these games are either weird or some person with a sword. There's no in between. Now, there were a couple of things that really stuck out from this little experiment. First, cutscenes or otherwise unique build-ups like the Puterscent or Scadutree Avatar's multiple phases made the encounters carry more immediate weight to blind players. Second, Rellana is incredible, even among other remembrances. She was the only boss that almost every single person in the test assumed would be required, despite having no cutscene or unique entrance. Any boss that rushed the player with no build-up, like Gaius or Ramina, were often described by the subjects as feeling like guard dogs, like they were obstacles protecting something that was more important than they were. And that, at the end of the day, proved my thought with Ramina. Even as the last boss fight that players watched in the playlist, which you'd usually think would lean people towards thinking of Ramina first, Ramina is a really understated encounter. There is no massive explosion or escalation. The music is tense, yes, but it's not as grand as tracks like Dancing Lion or Rellana. Ramina fulfills the role as a required boss fight while also not trying to stand out or stand alongside the top brass of the DLC. And honestly, that makes Ramina one of the most fascinating remembrances in the game to me. Her design is astonishing. One thing every single subject agreed on was that it was one of their favorites among the bunch. The use of color in the arena gives the fight a life and beauty, especially with the harsh pink of her glaive sticking out against the pale sky when she begins to fly around. The purple explosive butterflies are gorgeous, clear, and unique, and her melee attacks with the glaive are particularly easy to read. The one attack that feels strange is this triple-hitting spin move, which often feels just a little off to dodge for me. But considering the abnormal creature design, it's amazing that these attacks read and translate to the player as well as they do. On top of that, Ramina has one of my single favorite pieces of gameplay design in all of Elden Ring. It is such a small detail, barely anything at all, but it is this, right here. When she does her huge delayed slam, there is a visual and auditory cue letting players know it is time to roll. These delayed moves are often frustrating to learn, and they happen a lot in Elden Ring. I mean, even Gaius had a variation of this similar move, and you just had to feel the timing. This single flash of light takes out any guesswork while still not feeling gamey to me. It makes Ramina immediately accessible, and I think it's a shame that outside of a very slight flash on Messmer that very frequently gets lost, she's one of the only bosses that use this kind of signal in her delayed attacks. It makes the fight so much more pleasant to learn. As surprising as a lot of major fights or big phase transitions were in Elden Ring, realizing that Ramina was actually required when I burned the ceiling tree behind her was one of the single most shocking moments in the DLC for me. She feels so tucked away at the back of the ruins, poisoned by scarlet rot in a corner of the map, and going from her to the final dungeon is a surreal shift. Honestly, I think that's intentional. Going through Elden Ring, bosses have landed securely in one of 2 camps: a huge climax, half defined by its spectacle and atmosphere, or a gameplay challenge placed in an arena shaped like a basic geometric shape. Ramina is one of those few bosses that dabble in both. Though she has more detail in her design and moveset than foes like the Death Knights or the Great Red Bears, enough to make her feel like a remembrance, she also stays focused and grounded. Her moveset gets dramatic, yes, but never has anything like Gaius spinning like a top in the air, or the Puterscent Knight dismounting from his horse as he and the horse start rushing forward together, or Midra lighting his arena on fire. She is a monster with scarlet rot, and she stays true to that concept start to finish, even as the second phase has her using her wings and butterflies more frequently. She has 35,000 hit points, which does make her more durable than a lot of those smaller bosses, but also pales in comparison to the bulk on what most remembrances in the second half of this DLC have. And honestly, I love that about her. I love that she isn't the hardest boss in the game, but she's still challenging enough to need to be respected. I love that she's dramatic and visually gorgeous, but keeps the focus on the basic gameplay that defines the game as a whole. She may lack the importance and weight of those bosses that were voted over her in the experiment, but I am fairly confident that is what From Software wanted. When I found Ramina for the first time, I assumed she was a side boss, and I imagine most people probably would. Hidden at the back end of this long maze that was accessed through a side passageway in the Shadowkeep with no cutscene or spectacle, she feels like a hidden foe. And though I can only speak for myself, the experiment helped cement it. I felt I had discovered something hidden when I found Ramina. The end result was that when I finally came out on top and burned that tree, arriving in Anir Ilum felt like I had found something I was not supposed to, hidden behind small, hidden doors and labyrinthian tunnels. Despite the fact that Anir Ilum is one of the only required regions in the DLC, it made beginning to explore that place feel that much more magical. And yes, Ramina isn't as spectacular as Messmer or Radahn, but that understated nature lets her not only fulfill a satisfying gameplay role as a boss fight, but also manages to build up towards Anir Ilum in a way that just a boss fight like the Red Wolf of Radagon or the Godskin Noble couldn't. It is a very narrow and strange line to walk, and I think Ramina nails it. This might be a bit of a weird take, but I'm gonna give Ramina an S grade. Elden Ring's best bosses have historically been their biggest ones, and Ramina manages to stand out not by matching them, but instead focusing on the elements that will make her great. An excellent character design, solid gameplay, gorgeous color palette and atmosphere, and even those gameplay adjustments that make her all the more satisfying to face as a required boss at the end of this story. Meanwhile, while Ramina excelled in how well she blended into the world of Elden Ring while still providing a gameplay challenge, Midra, the Lord of Frenzied Flame, had absolutely no desire to blend in with the rest of this DLC. Though the end of the DLC is Consort Radahn, there are two other bosses that I think stand as climaxes and finales of the DLC. Metter might also count as one, but she doesn't stick the landing, so I'm not counting her here. Those two other bosses, of course, are Midra and Bayle, who both feel like they could end the DLC on their own, even though they are securely side content. Major boss fights, hidden in far back corners and reaches of the map. To reach Midra, the player needs to find a secret path in the Shadowkeep. This will provide access to Jori, and once the player beats Jori, they head through the Abyssal Woods. Outside of a few rats and inquisitors, most of the enemies in the Abyssal Woods are based on Bloodborne's Winter Lanterns. If you get seen, you usually end up dead, and unlike the Winter Lanterns, there is no sneaking up behind them and attacking. These things cannot be killed. The player slowly sneaks their way through this silent area that Torrent was so afraid of that he ran away and eventually reached Midra's manse. Throughout the area, they're told repeatedly to leave, and the screams of some figures spill from outside the arena. Entering regardless, because this is Elden Ring, and you walk towards the screaming in Elden Ring, the player faces Midra, a decrepit old man, barely in enough rags to cover what little is left of his body. He dies quickly, and the DLC presents what I think is its only above-average cutscene. Midra grabs hold of the object lodged in his skull, letting it break through his paper-thin hands as blood rushes down the golden stem. We get this gorgeously lit shot as his hands grip it and pull it out, with his head beginning to tear off with it. And the screen goes black, and he tears his own head from his body. In the word of one of my test subjects in the experiment, yo, that guy ripped his head off, and then it became a sun. What the fuck? Midra is the Lord of Frenzied Flame, the bad ending of the base game now revealed as an enemy here. And with that, the actual fight begins. Interestingly, the enemy version of Midra always has to be killed. Every fight begins with this cutscene, making Midra and the Dragon Lord Placidusax the only two cutscene bosses that have identical beginning circumstances on every single attempt, whereas every other boss in the game loses their introductory cutscene, often slightly adjusting their location and starting animation on later attempts. Wielding the object he pulled from his head as a now blood-drenched greatsword and a shattered piece of the blade as a dagger in his offhand, Midra uses melee weapons and magic from the flame that has replaced his head to form the base of his moveset, and it is incredible. In the first phase, the melee combos are exactly what you'd expect, stabs with the daggers and swings with the greatsword that make him feel like somewhat of a magical knight. He can spill out madness in a few different shapes, all of which feel chaotic but are still very clearly dodgeable without too much precision. Every single hit in his moveset here inflicts madness, and with the tempo of the fight, madness is often a death knell. Madness does 15% of your max health, drains a portion of your mana, and more importantly, puts the player in a vulnerable state for a short time, which, combined with the hit that put you into Madness, the Madness damage, usually means it's enough time for Midra to finish you off. Upon reaching 70% of his 47,000 point long health bar, he rises into the air as the flame continues to grow and crashes into the ground with a huge explosion. This is the only attack that I ever felt was unnatural to dodge. It never quite clicked in my mind. Sometimes I could run away and avoid it, but it felt like somewhat of a coin flip. Even when I was hit by it though, I never got too upset, because it's just one of the smoothest phase transitions in the game. The room lights up as the fire turns the wooden room into a crucible, fire licking the walls more and more as the fight escalates, and Midra's moveset evolves in such a cool way. He keeps all of his same attacks, but he gains more magical attacks, he gains more variations on his melee combos, particularly variations that now begin to contort his body more than before, flying him into the air, creating after effects of madness, flame, explosive effects as his sword seems to almost come alive with magic. There's not as stark a shift as there is with battles like Messmer, but by the time you've reached the end here, every human aspect of Midra has been replaced as this corpse is flying around like a flaming puppet. The escalation from a ragged old man to unthinkable creature somehow feels incredibly natural, and all those flames on the edges of the arena keep burning uncomfortably slowly, almost to the point where the flames become stagnant, like they're watching the player in Midra fight. And that's pushed even further with the music, which is a contender for my single favorite Elden Ring boss theme. I had a friend describe it best. This song makes it feel like you are constantly falling up. It's disorienting, threatening, and there's never a moment where it feels like the tension ebbs. It's just build up as this lord rises higher and higher before you, becoming more and more monstrous and powerful with every moment that he's still alive. By the time the fight has come to an end, there is a palpable sense of tension that this song has built, and it works incredibly well with the delays and spins as the body is rotating while the head stays in place, explodes, and your madness bar slowly fills as an impending warning of death. Despite having more overall health than Bayle or Radahn, he also feels less durable than they do due to lower resistances and the fact that the fight is constantly moving. There are a lot more opportunities to counterattack than there are in the other two boss fights. Personally, I found Midra the easiest of what I consider the three final opponents of the DLC, but the tension and atmosphere combined with expert timing on his moveset make him my favorite of the trio. And honestly, I think he even beats Messmer out for my favorite boss of the DLC. The one thing that works against him is that the run through the Abyssal Woods is long and uncomfortable on your first run, but a stealth-focused area designed to make you feel unsafe loses a lot of punch on later playthroughs when you know all of its tricks. And without Torrent, it also starts to feel like a very long chore. But that's a failure of the Abyssal Woods and its atmosphere slipping rather than an issue with Midra himself. Midra is another easy S-grade boss, and for the moment holds the title of my favorite encounter in Elden Ring. And to know he's well enough hidden that he can be fairly easily missed is a shame, because as the experiment showed, Midra carries some serious weight as one of the DLC's most significant boss fights. I'd like to take you to the beginning of my Shadow of the Erdtree journey. After entering Gravesite Plains, I faced what was once the Black Gaol Knight, and then continued to meet all the NPCs in the center of the zones. With only 2 blessings, I found myself face to face with Rellana, and threw myself into that death for attempt after attempt, until I finally came out on top. Realizing at that point I was violently underleveled, I explored the area around her and found the Ancient Dragon Man. I fought him and traveled through his cave. Found my way up to the Jagged Peak at Blessing level 4, before the Blessing buff, too. Every single boss here could kill me in what felt like a moment, and though I did sprint past one boss fight because I just didn't want to deal with it, Bayle the Dread ended up being the second Remembrance level boss that I found, even before the Divine Beast Dancing Lion. At that point, I had realized I had probably gone too far and I needed to go back to the plains. But before facing Bayle, the player is introduced to the fact that the Jagged Peak holds more than naked dragon men via the Jagged Peak Drake. Using Miyazaki's favorite trope of a large open space scattered with corpses, but it turns out one of them isn't a corpse and is here to kill you now, the Jagged Peak Drake rises up and attacks. Like the Ghostflame Dragon, the Jagged Piece Drake has the same improvements to the base game Dragon moveset, with more emphasis on melee attacks, and definitely makes him more of a threat, especially if you find him at Blessing level 4. He boasts 32,000 hit points, so not outrageously tanky when you're supposed to find him, pretty tanky early on in the DLC, even with that 50% weakness to any strikes on his head. He has more resistances than the Ghostflame Dragon, and far less of a glaring weakness, but is also vulnerable to bleed and frostbite again, which is how I ended up facing him so early. The Drake doesn't try to do anything wildly different or unique compared to the other Drakes or Dragons in the later part of the game. Like a Gaol or Grail, the Jagged Peak Drake is straightforward, relying on his now well-known moveset combined with those new melee attacks and an area of effect attack that creates lightning strikes on the ground, a move that's starting to prepare the player for the Remembrance at the end of the region. Despite being in a large, mostly flat, but very slightly sloped arena, my biggest issue with this Drake is how it interacts with that arena. With so many moves that fly back and breathe fire, or so much forward ground covered with the new melee attacks, I've had multiple occasions where the Drake got stuck on the mountains outside of the arena, or even entirely un-aggroes from the fight and starts walking in a circle. Outside of that, however, this Drake sits at the level of challenge and has the moveset that I think the base game Drakes needed to regularly boast. This was the first Drake I tried to learn fighting on foot, and slowly learning the moveset more and more throughout the fight was really satisfying, even if it made the base game version feel even less intimidating by comparison. I think the Jagged Peak Drake earns a B grade. It welcomes the player into the Jagged Peak with a clear message as to what the ancient dragon man was protecting, introduces lightning attacks that the player will need to get used to by the end of the area, and though it suffers from some arena issues, still delivers a solid dragon experience. I am curious why the translation has this be a Drake, where a Gaol was a dragon. I mean, by definition, these are all Drakes. They have always all been Drakes. But is it just a matter of allegiance to Bayle, or is there some other reason why this is labeled as a Drake when everything in the base game was a dragon? After beating the Jagged Peak Drake, Elden Ring asks its old question one more time before the end. What if there were two of them? Thankfully, the designers weren't mad enough to have two Drakes rushing at the player. The dueling Jagged Peak Drakes are actually only one boss. Another Jagged Peak Drake, this time scaled up to 39,000 hit points, fighting against a standard Drake, which I believe starts at around 26,000 hit points, which is about 70% of the standard Drake health bar. Though the Drakes remain satisfying, there are two big issues with the duo fight here. The first is that the only thing telling the two Drakes apart is that the boss version has an aura of electricity coming off it, which, I'll be honest, I only ever noticed rewatching and analyzing this footage after having fought it twice. You can also figure out which one's which if the enemy version is damaged, since its health bar always appears whenever it takes any kind of damage, but that's not always a reliable method. The second is similar to the Ghostflame Dragon and the Shadow Altus problem, albeit nowhere near as frustrating. The dragons feel like they do almost no damage to each other here. The player can swing once with a tiny little knife and do a decent piece of damage to the dragon, but if another Drake does a huge combo on it, barely an inconvenience. Especially when they start breathing fire at each other, which usually does enough damage to almost one-shot a player, it's barely a breeze against the other dragon's resistances, and it just makes the duo part of the fight go on a lot longer than it feels like it should. I understand that they wanted the player to be the key figure in this fight, and encouraged them to participate in the duo portion of it. And participating is much less frustrating here than it was with the hordes of knights fighting the Ghostflame Dragon, because the two dragons will often be focusing on each other more than you. It is still, however, a long, drawn-out battle, as one Drake's fire will keep you from attacking the other for a short time. The player often isn't in danger, but ends up running away from crossfire more often than not. The Drakes can always move faster than the player can too, meaning it's very possible they'll abandon the player as they continue their duel. With that said, it remains a worthwhile fight to do when repeating the DLC, because completing this fight awards the player with access to the next part of Aigon's quest, which I will get to later. But finishing this battle to be rewarded by the praise of Aigon is incredibly satisfying, and really brings the spectacle-focused battle to a head by verbally telling the player they are the coolest person here, which is something From Software rarely actually does. Overall, I think the dueling Drakes earn a C grade. Though the player is likely very familiar with the moveset, they aren't overwhelmed by the Drakes by just one back-to-back at this point, especially since the fights are so different. And the challenge has continued to escalate as the player rises up the mountain, and ending with Aigon arriving to complement the player and start the questline the mountain builds towards makes it all feel worthwhile. despite the occasional frustration that the fight can present. With only 4 bosses left, we're about to reach what I believe is a collection of really solid fights. But before we do, there is one more dud the DLC has. That number 2 spot on bosses I wish were cut in one of the only 2 fights in the DLC that I actively avoid. After fighting 1 Drake, and fighting 2 Drakes, the player faces an ancient dragon. Though I didn't skip it like the second dancing lion on my second playthrough, I've never fought this dragon with any kind of honor. Senesax is such a mess of balancing and design that it made me replay the main game to see if I had actually hated Lanciax the entire time, but nope, the choices in Senesax's battle are just that frustrating. First, world placement. There are no enemies on the run up Jagged Peak, which feels amazing. It gives the area an exceptional atmosphere unlike anything else in the game, but the end result is that, in terms of gameplay, you fight a dragon, then you fight 2 dragons, and then you fight an even harder dragon, and then you get to fight the actual thing you're here to fight, and all but the final boss are technically skippable. I have a very small sample size, of course, but all of my friends who had played Elden Ring fought the first set of Drakes, died once to Senesax, and then ran past him and either never bothered to come back or came back at the end of the DLC. Senesax is likely here to make it clear to a player that the top of the mountain is designed for a character near the end of the DLC, but the rest of Senesax's design is so sloppy that it doesn't actually communicate that. Senesax is almost identical to Lanciax, gaining 2 new attacks. A new variation of the lightning attack that resembles Fortisax's bolt that is stopped by his legs, and a dive bomb attack that is, surprisingly enough, the least irritating move in Senesax's moveset. And that's mainly because it doesn't use lightning. The lightning that was once fine, if not occasionally frustrating in the previous Ancient Dragon fights, is a mess here because the floor is covered with water, which does 2 things to the player. The first is that the player constantly has a weakness to lightning damage effects, which combines with the extreme endgame lightning damage to make Sensiax deal as much, if not more damage than the many remembrances in the game. But what gets really out of control is that when lightning hits water, it creates an AoE burst, and with every single attack is creating lightning after effects, mixing that with water makes for an obnoxious moveset with usually triple effects from every single attack. It looks similar to something you know well, but it is incredibly unique. It is not at all like the other Ancient Dragon. Like I said, Sensiax is balanced for the end of the DLC, with my biggest proof being that he has 45,500 hit points, which is 4,500 more than Bayle the Dread, and only 500 less than Consort Radahn. And though there is a weak point on his head, Ancient Dragons have their head even less reliably accessible than the Drakes. There were 2 reliable ways I found to face Senesax. Strategy number 1. Lure him out of the water onto this 45-degree slope, which means you'll be fighting with his normal moveset, albeit with the game and the camera having a stroke most of the fight because this dragon was not meant to be fought on this 45-degree slope. All the muscle memory from the other Ancient Dragons started working here, and the fun parts of those fights were even occasionally present, though ruined by the spectacle of the dragon being replaced by the dragon violently clipping into the floor or disappearing off camera or otherwise trying to fly away and landing instead when he tries to dive bomb. Strategy number 2 was to break his AI with the horse, hitting him in a very specific rhythm that had him continuously turning around towards the player rather than attacking. I mean, it doesn't matter how bad his hitboxes are if he never attacks. But neither of these are at all fun, and Senesax's only reward is upgrade materials to max out your weapon, which is a very strange reward to be placed at the end of a DLC that assumes your weapon was maxed out the entire time. He earns in F grade, and honestly, I don't see a world where I won't just run past him to reach the much better dragon at the top of the mountain. And that better dragon, of course, is Bayle the Dread. Like Dark Eater Midir before him, Bayle is an optional final dragon that aims to match the scale of challenge of the final boss of the DLC. And despite being a massive threat with huge spectacle, when I finished my experiment, everyone said that Bayle felt too massive to be required. That he was so clearly an optional endgame boss that he stood apart from the rest of the experiment not for his cutscenes or suggestion lore, but because he was just clearly that much of a challenge. I still remember watching the last trailer before the DLC came out, where there was this 2-second clip of Bayle attacking the player with a lightning breath, and I knew it would be one of the last bosses in the DLC and I would die a lot. Somehow, I still ran into him as my 7th fight out of 42, which of course made Bayle this massive threat that I knew I'd need to come back to through the whole DLC. And throughout the DLC, I kept returning, stronger and stronger each time. It led to an insanely satisfying victory once I finally came out on top. In terms of moveset, Bayle does decently, but does have two things I'm not a huge fan of. Things like his bite or basic combo are excellent, as are his slams, jumps, and a lot of fire breath attacks, though some of the hitboxes on the straight breath forward are somewhat notorious for being finicky. He does have a second phase transition where he starts gaining more lightning after effects, creating more explosions the player needs to dodge, and upping his aggression. My first issue is that in Bayle's spectacular second phase attack, where he flies around the arena, shoots fireballs at the player for a while, then dives down, creating this huge explosion, and then leaving a trail that explodes shortly after. The attack itself is fine, though I struggle to dodge the fireballs especially. My big issue is that, and a lot of his larger attacks here, take a lot of time. The double fire breath, for example, takes 9 seconds to go off and does not leave a reliable window for the player to counterattack afterwards, which means the player will often have to endure a number of long attacks in order to land 1 or 2 hits. Bayle has 41,000 hit points and has high resistances, meaning he has enough health to be a very long fight, even with efficient play. The second issue is that opportunities to attack his head are often rare in this moveset. Though he does have 2 weak spots, with both his head and leg stump taking more damage, I prefer fighting his head in terms of interacting with the rest of the moveset. But depending on attack luck, standing under him and attacking the stump can often feel more successful. In terms of raw moveset, I preferred how Midir always ended up providing an opportunity to attack. Though it can make it turn-based, it took RNG out of the equation. You would always have an opportunity to land that effective hit, which really pushed you towards that playstyle. But discussing attacking the head and the stump leads into something else Bayle does better than any dragon in a From Software game up to this point. His design is beyond extraordinary. The shape of his body evokes the drakes and dragons the player has fought up to this point, while the scales and detail make it clear that Bayle is a level above the others. There's a ton of wordless storytelling happening here, with some of the Dragon Lord's ripped off heads having grown into Bayle's scales, and his torn off arm leaving this exposed bone that he uses as a spear, plus the fact that he is missing a leg and uses his tail to do something resembling walking, before in phase 2 he grows spectral wings and takes to the sky, revealing his wings had been torn off. Bayle feels like that old grizzly bear with gunshot and weapon wounds, missing an eye from some fight with a huge creature while he's still the most powerful creature in the forest, and I love every piece of it. But there's one more thing that Bayle does, something that no other boss in From Software's library up to this point has done. If you came to me before Shadow of the Erdtree released and told me that From Software was preparing to release the best media adaptation of Moby Dick that I've ever personally seen, I would not have believed you, but here is our white whale. And Captain Ahab in Elden Ring is Drake Warrior Aigon. Aigon was a Drake warrior who hunted Bayle and failed. His body was destroyed, his limbs broken. You find him while traveling towards ancient Dragonland, screaming in pain and vowing vengeance on Bayle. The player leaves him there and encounters him again after beating the dueling drakes. He praises the player as a fellow Drake warrior, and you learn he has been dragging himself up the mountain with all of his limbs broken. And though he is still driven to win, his body has failed him. And so, asking one final favor, he tears off his own finger and asks the player for a boon. Summon him, and his vengeful spirit will help ensure that Bayle dies. Only then will he allow himself to pass. I understand people like playing Elden Ring without summons, and for the most part I'm usually the same. But though Bayle is an impressive boss fight, Bayle with Aigon is one of the most incredible climaxes I have ever seen in a From Software game. At this point, if you've seen nothing else about the DLC before this video, I imagine you've already heard his scream when he is summoned into the arena. Now, you might be saying, just because Aigon is hunting a big monster that broke his body doesn't necessarily mean he's Captain Ahab hunting Moby Dick. Bad news, From Software disagrees, because his internal reference data calls him Dragon Communion Ahab, and he wields harpoons. And you can't tell me that Aigon would be out of place screaming, "From hell's heart I stab at thee. For hate's sake I spit my last breath at thee." Aigon's monologue captures that same level of scale and language found in Moby Dick, which is not a sentence I expected to say at all going into this DLC. Lines that he has like solid of scale you might be, but I will riddle with holes your rotten hide, sound like they belong in a 200-year-old book about dragon slaying. It is incredible. And if you play without summoning, I implore you, please break that rule and summon Aigon. The quest doesn't go anywhere else, and it is incredibly easy to unlock Aigon for this climax. Aigon has more dialogue when he dies and when he wins. His victory dialogue creates an incredible cathartic moment as his soul leaves your world, and he dies victorious, with his final words claiming, "You shall haunt me no longer." It sends shivers down my spine every time. But let me play you a clip from the first time I beat Bayle, an attempt where Aigon died moments before his prey did. The way that timed out with Bayle losing control of his lightning and destroying him is one of those moments that is just something extraordinary. And once that happened, I knew I wanted to summon again, that I had to summon again, because to me, though Bayle is an exceptional boss fight, adding in Aigon turns him into something unlike anything else in this library. Bayle would be a high A grade in terms of moveset, potentially a low S grade boss in his own right without any story, but as soon as you add Aigon into the mix, he turns from an extraordinary optional finale into one of Elden Ring's most memorable encounters, and somehow one of the best literary adaptations in video games. Bayle is an S grade boss, and though I prefer the gameplay of Messmer and Midra, neither of them reach the spectacle of Bayle the Dread and the Drake Warrior Aigon. Now, Aigon was one of the best NPCs in From Software's library, only matched by boss fights that were given prior characterization, like Ishinashina. But Shadow of the Erdtree in general does a really incredible job with its cast of NPCs, and right before the ending of the DLC, as you're traveling towards Miquella and the final battle, the NPC who once guided you here stands in your way. Now, this is the most choice-dependent battle in From Software's Souls-like library. It's possible the player only has one ally in the Sanguine Noble, or that they have Sir Onze and Fallingstar with them, whereas Needlelight Leda and Dryleaf Dane always stand against you, but Redmane Freya, Moore, and the Hornscent can all join their side, depending on the choices you made. When the player arrives in the DLC, all of these NPCs are working as a single team, people from all walks of life and beliefs, all now serving Miquella and his world of kindness. But once his charm is broken, everyone returns to their old allegiances, to their old mindsets. Needlelight Leda tries to slaughter anyone who she deems as against Miquella. Onze tries to discover what Miquella did to Mohg's body. Moore is lost to depression, and Freya tries to find information on Radahn's old oaths. And every storyline comes to a head here. And it is an NPC fight at its core, and I know how much people in the comments despise NPC fights. People were upset that I thought Gideon made for a solid boss encounter. And from a gameplay standpoint, this battle is chaotic, unpredictable, and often frustrating. But when it comes together, and when the player is invested in the stories of these 7 characters, this is one of the strongest story beats From Software has had in one of their games. There is no major health bar here, which means you could argue that this is not a boss fight under my definition, but this is my video and I want to talk about Leda, and there is so much detail placed into this required encounter that it feels almost cheap to ignore it. Every single character, outside of the Sanguine Noble, serves as a backup if the player has no other allies to summon, like yours truly on my first playthrough, has something to say as they arrive, as they die, and to each other as they're fighting, as well as final messages if they're the one to kill the player. The amount of dialogue in this boss fight is a lot more than From Software usually places in their fights, and even now I know there are lines and interactions that I still haven't heard. Enemies arrive in waves, one at a time, with your allies interspersed among them. Freya serves Radahn, first and foremost, and her joining Leda is the greatest hint as to what the player is about to face as the final boss, as she joins if the player has helped Ansbach uncover Miquella's plans, and then fulfilled his wish that Freya know what Miquella has done to Radahn and Mohg. She holds to her old oaths and has nothing but respect for the opponents she faces. She's also easily the most powerful of these 5 opponents, with an incredible defense and offensive option that turn her into a nightmare as soon as any other enemies are summoned in. She has a lot of dialogue, in particular with Sir Onsbach. She praises you as a lord, and she and Onsbach complement each other throughout the entire battle, knowing that there was never any world where they wouldn't have to face each other here. The Hornsent joins Lida if you didn't summon him to help kill Messmer, promising that his clan will have a chance to redeem themselves once Miquella ascends to godhood and takes Marigga's place. He's a glass cannon, easy to stagger, and easily the most fragile of Lida's allies, but he does a ton of damage. All of his dialogue is angry, bitter, and violent. Mor is dressed in heavy armor and doesn't wield a weapon. He just has a big great shield and throws pots to inflict status conditions. He joins Lida's team if the player convinces him not to give in to his despair. Despite the fact that Dane and Lida are fully sworn to create Miquella's world of peace, both of them enter this fight enthusiastically. Mor hates the fact that things have reached this point, and he mentions how much he wishes all this fighting hadn't happened. He believes in a world of kindness, and yet here he is, killing with everyone else. Dane and Lida are, of course, always present. They both firmly believe that Miquella will create a world of absolute peace and love, and Lida will kill any man, woman, or child to ensure that everyone exists peacefully. Dane's moveset is a 1-for-1 from his boss fight, while Lida usually stays further back, using Ashes of War to put ranged pressure on the player while still attacking quickly with her blade. On her own, she's one of the least threatening, but as soon as she's working alongside allies, the build becomes incredibly difficult to handle. In terms of allies, defeating the Puterscent Knight and finding Saint Trina can eventually unlock Sir Thalier, a quiet man who follows Saint Trina. Now, the way I understand it, as someone who is not a lore YouTuber, Saint Trina is to Miquella as Radagon is to Marigga. But where Radagon continued to serve Marigga, the love Saint Trina has for the world left her leaving her followers a message and request. Miquella must fail. Please kill him. Thalier is terrified and is physically frail. He uses poison mists and dagger strikes to inflict status effects, with his dedication to Saint Trina overwhelming any connection to these people that he may once have had. And of course, I mentioned him back with Mohg. It is everyone's favorite NPC, Sir Onsbach, a devotee of Mohg who you recruit by helping him realize exactly what Miquella has done. Even under Miquella's spell, there was a part of Onsbach that knew something was wrong, and in the Shadowkeep, he realized that Mohg had been influenced by Miquella, and Miquella had collected Mohg's body to use as a vessel to bring back the spirit of Erdan as his consort. And with his consort, Miquella plans to ascend to divinity, creating his world of kindness, and controlling anything that does not obey. Onsbach not only plans to stop this and free Mohg's body in death, but is so bound by honor that he tells Freya about the plan, even knowing that, honor bound to Erdan, she will stand against him. Onsbach compliments every single one of his enemies. He has nothing but respect for them. He even tells Lida in the fight that she was right, that he could never sit back and watch this come to pass. All of his lines make this fight feel incredible, and when you talk to him afterwards and he tells you that he holds nothing against you for killing Mohg, really brings the quest to a beautiful conclusion. All of these NPCs end up with satisfying finales to their story, whether in death or in the final battle with Erdan. There's enough dialogue here that the entire fight is filled with it. Conversations and final words as more and more bodies are summoned into you and Lida's battle. The music here is gorgeous and captures the dramatic and emotional weight of this moment perfectly, and in some ways almost proves why Miquella is wrong. He is creating a world of peace and kindness, and to do so, anyone who does not fall in line must be erased. Lida's zealotry serves as a proof that this will not be a utopian paradise. It will be a world of obedience, where fear of death or something far worse keeps the violence in line. On top of that, the arena's color design is gorgeous. The sand in the room is a stark white, matching Lida's robes, and as the fight progresses, blood drenches the arena. You see firsthand exactly what the price of Miquella's kindness is. The visions of gods are paid for by the blood of every single person here who believes in something. And this fight, to me, is what proves that Miquella is a monster. But of course, at the end of the day, it is still limited as an NPC fight. Thus, I think it earns an A grade. The atmosphere and story are Elden Ring at its best, but it struggles to be a fun encounter, especially if you missed some of the summons and ended up with the wordless Sanguine Noble as your only ally. When I discussed Starscourge Radahn, I mentioned him getting nerfed, and a few comments did make the correct point that he wasn't actually nerfed, he was more fixed. That his hitboxes were shrunk to match the animations, and there wasn't as much of a statistical decrease to his power. The same thing does not go for Promised Consort Radahn. He was not patched, he was nerfed. There is no ifs, ands, or buts. And don't get me wrong, that is a good thing, he needed that. His AI was changed, his animations were adjusted, the end leg on most of his attacks was changed, and the frame data and hitboxes on some of his more infamous moves were adjusted. One of the reasons this video took so long was because I had already beaten Radahn twice, and then he got nerfed the week after, and so I had to do a quick third playthrough on New Game Plus with the Katana build to actually get some footage of the boss in its current state. Radahn opens with another cutscene, and like most of the DLC, it is fine. The only cutscene I really love in Shadow of the Erdtree is Midra. Everything else just feels like it's going through some motions. Though the voice acting is on point, the thing I love the most about this fight is the concept of Radahn's spirit being infused into Mohg's body, especially with how well it contrasts with the boss theming of Elden Ring in general. Throughout Elden Ring, we fight beings who have long since faded. Radahn, when we fight him in Caelid, is rabid and animalistic. Malekith has completely forgotten who he is, Godfrey's weapons and armor are falling apart, Messmer has been sitting in a dark room for who knows how long, Midra is a literal corpse, Bayle is missing an entire leg. The only demigod that feels fully in control of their mind and body throughout the entire fight and does not ever lose themselves to madness or become overwhelmed by some curse is Mohg, and knowing that Miquella was controlling him gives that design choice a bit of a unique twist. Consort Radahn is, of course, the other exception to this rule. He is at his peak here, and it makes him stand out from the rest of the roster. Radahn's first phase was always solid, but after the nerf, it's become a contender for my favorite moveset in this game. With new recovery frames added and a longer startup from this cross-slash, the moveset walks the perfect line. Attacks are fast and deal heavy damage, but the combo strings are recognizable enough that it's always easy to tell what moves are coming next. On top of that, there's multiple ways to dodge and deal with everything. So even if there is an optimal way to technically move in, any player can succeed. There's enough delayed attacks that the moveset feels engaging, while none of those delays last long enough to feel abnormal. The charge attack is easy to punish in time, even if it doesn't have the clarity of Ramina's Red Flash. His gravity pulse that pulls into a huge AoE can be difficult to dodge and feel at first, but since he always dashes away prior to pulling that pulse out now, it never leads to unavoidable damage. After the nerf, I've also found that if I got caught by the pull, I could still semi-reliably sprint and jump away from the AoE to avoid a decent majority of the damage. And, of course, a thrust into Mohg's Bloodflame explosion does a great job wordlessly communicating what Miquella has done to create his consort. Led Mohg to his death just to use his body as a vessel for the now once again lucid Radahn. But speaking of Radahn, this moveset does an incredible job invoking imagery of the first encounter while still feeling like its own unique battle. All his melee swings often swing out and up towards his chest, which mimics that wide sweep of Starscourge Radahn really well, even if it lacks the constant mobility that the horse provided. The dragging leap into the air that throws rocks towards the player does a great job using the rocks from the Starscourge's second phase, while also increasing the precision required to dodge that move. And the second phase even has the same leap into the air that drops into a huge explosion. I've always had a harder time dodging this version of the move than in the Starscourge arena, since the lack of torrent makes it harder to actively position yourself while finding and watching the meteor crash into the ground, but I enjoy the callback at the very least. Everything about that first phase lands correctly for me, and then about 65% into the 46,000 deep health pool, an amount made even more terrifying, by the way, due to incredibly high resistances to everything, with his 20% resistance to piercing being the closest thing he has to vulnerability. He drops to one knee and the second phase begins. Like in the first phase, this transition is alright. It's nothing incredible, but it's mostly Miquella showing up, giving Radahn a crisp high five, and then posing. With that said, the music here is spectacular. It captures the scale and threat of Miquella incredibly well, while also doing some great callbacks to Radahn's original song musically. Now, I should lead by saying this phase was improved a lot by the nerfs. Prior to the nerfs, trying to win without summons felt like it demanded almost absolute mastery. There was no moment of pause, and even finding a moment to counterattack was easier said than done. With that nerf though, I think Radahn still ends up being the hardest boss in the game just from this second phase. His resistances go up even higher, and his moveset completely adjusts. The first and most obvious thing here is that on top of the same moveset, every swing of the sword now creates various shapes of explosive light that try to catch the player. On one hand, these can be incredibly satisfying to move around, and with the brightness dialed down as part of the nerf, it's not nearly as disorienting. My biggest issue is that it disrupts the timing of the first phase a lot. If you're slightly clipped by an attack in phase 1, you can often time your recovery roll to get back into the swing of things without too much of an issue. If you were standing in the wrong place when you get hit in phase 2, however, you stagger into the light burst, which staggers you into the next attack, which staggers you into the next light burst, meaning his long combos become much more punishing. Many of them can still be satisfying to dodge, but now there's often a specific right way to dodge that minimizes the potential threat that the light bursts provide, which gets really frustrating with the cross slash. Now, if you roll anywhere other than Radahn's side, you're going to get hit. You can't roll back, you can't roll to the side. You have to roll in every time. And that wouldn't be too much of a problem, except for one of the two really big issues I have with this second phase. The first being that Miquella needs a goddamn haircut. Radahn is much taller than the player, and he moves quickly enough that they'll want to be locked on, but with the camera tilted up and lights exploding around the player constantly, the huge secondary cape that is Miquella's hair ends up being hard to get any real visibility through. Especially whenever I was on Radahn's side, I had a really hard time seeing one of his swords raised before he turned into an attack, which meant that I got caught off guard from attacks that I know I had down in the first phase. Like Malenia, it does look great from a design perspective, and it does have a lot more clear of a silhouette overall than the wings did, but it adds a lot of mess to the fight. With that said, Miquella also adds a lot of new attacks, particularly when it comes to the grab. This is the most pronounced move in Radahn's kit, leaving a large window but dealing no damage. When Radahn grabs you, Miquella promises you a beautiful world of peace. Then, if he grabs you a second time, Miquella's promise becomes reality, and the player instantly dies as they pledge their allegiance to Miquella. I love this grab so much. It is such a cool way to tie Miquella's ability to influence minds while still being fair. This is also where Miquella's Great Rune comes in. You can activate it here in order to dispel the first grab's effect so that you don't die the next time. However, the fight's fast-paced enough that usually the best way to deal with that is to just not get grabbed in the first place. That said, my biggest issue isn't that the combos have a specific right way to dodge them. That worked well with fights like Rellana. It's not that the player is punished more than it occasionally feels fair. That worked with bosses like Midra. Or it's not even the fact that the hair gets in the way. There was a lot of visibility problems with Bayle. It's the shadow clone jutsu attacks. There are a ton of attacks that Radahn sends a ghost of himself forward 3 or 4 times that will deal only a fraction of the damage but still stagger the player. They home in really precisely, and then after he does all of those, he immediately does the actual attack, doing a ton of damage and usually following up with an explosion that needs to be very precisely rolled through. The nerf did a lot of job in making this attack less of a inconceivable flashbang, but dodging this still feels very inconsistent to me. Running, jumping, dodging, if you get caught by a single clone, you'll usually end up staggered and taking the whole attack, which just does a ridiculous amount of damage. As I've been working on trying to solo Radahn, these attacks have become more and more frustrating because it just turns the fight into a lottery of moves. When he does his combos, I have time to counterattack, to heal, to position for the next one. But if he leans towards these attacks, the precision and detail of the first phase feels like it's thrown to the wind and replaced with this strange teleport effect that requires some specific reliable way to dodge each unique one. And I have seen some of those, and I'm starting to learn some because I've seen them on level 1 and speedruns that do utilize them. But it is incredibly frustrating that every single one of these moves works just a little bit differently and has such specific ways to dodge, and even then, if you perform it even a little bit off, you'll still get hit and take most of your health. It lacks all the precision and challenge that makes the rest of Phase 2 and everything in Phase 1 so astonishing. And though the second phase does hold the fight back for me, I still like Radahn a lot. Though there was a lot of disappointment that Godwyn didn't make an appearance, I think Consort Radahn worked really well as a climax, even if the cutscene that follows after to end the DLC really doesn't do anything. On top of that, I don't think that those two flaws in the second phase hold him back as much as Malenia's hurt hers, and his first phase is just ridiculously satisfying to master, with that moveset easily standing alongside the other top brass. At this point, going through about 20 to 30 attempts trying to get the second phase completely soloed now, I've landed like 4 or 5 completely hitless phase 1s, and it doesn't stop being fun. Overall, I think I'll give Promised Consort Radahn an A grade. If the teleport attacks were gone, or just didn't stagger the player into the main attack as easily, or you could just run in one direction and avoid them and then just roll the main attack, he'd have a chance at an S grade, but the attacks just required too specific of movement for me, and the fact that I had to look up every single one of them, that none of them felt like natural dodges, just takes away from a lot of it. And with that, the journey has finally come to an end. Dark Souls 2, Bloodborne, Dark Souls 3, Sekiro, Demon Souls, and now every boss in Elden Ring all analyzed. I started this series with 11 subscribers, and we are now at almost 6,500, which is still a crazy number to me. Now, usually I like to have a visual tier list to order all the bosses, but there isn't any that has every single one of the 208 Elden Ring bosses on there, so instead of bloopers, I'll just be listing my boss order off at the end of this video. I plan to keep doing boss analyses on this channel. I already have a Hollow Knight analysis recorded, and I have a couple of other games already in mind, like Lies of P, Sultan Sanctuary, and Metal Gear Rising Revengeance, just to keep you on your toes with that last one. If there are any other games with a heavy emphasis on boss fights, let me know. I'd love to add more to my list. For now, thank you to everyone who joined me on this journey. It's been a really fun time, and I hope you'll stick around for more. You can also check out my alternate channel, Akashiro's Chronicles, for some Pathfinder 2e actual play and build guides. Otherwise, I suppose I'll see you in Hollow Nest. F-grade bosses. Number 208, the Divine Beast Dancing Lion in the Ruins. Number 207, the Valiant Gargoyles. Number 206, the Cemetery Shade in Liurnia. Number 205, the Scaly Misbegotten. Number 204, Godfroy the Grafted. Number 203, Royal Revenant. Number 202, the Ancient Dragon Senesax. Number 201, the Soldier of Godric. Number 200, the Miranda Blossom. Number 199, Necromancer Garrus. Number 198, the Sanguine Noble. Number 197, the Crucible Knight and Misbegotten Warrior. The D grade starts with number 196, the Grafted Scion, 195, the Tibia Mariner in Liurnia, 194, the Kindred of Rot, 193, the Spirit Caller Snail in Liurnia, 192 is the Lamenter, 191 for the Nox Sorceress and Monk, 190 for the Stone Digger Troll in the Altus Plateau, 189 for Battle Mage Hughes, 188 for the Crystallian in Liurnia, 187 for the Mad Pumpkin Heads, 186 for Curseblade Labirith, 185 for the Omen Killer and Miranda Flower Duo, 184 for the Guardian Golem, 183 for Radahn Thief of Fire, 182 for Count Ymir Mother of Fingers, 181 for the Erdtree Burial Watchdog in the Peninsula, 180 for Fia's Champions, 179 for the Cemetery Shade in the Peninsula, 178 for the Cemetery Shade in Caelid, 177 for the Onyx Lord in Liurnia, 176 for the Demi-Human Queen Margot, 175 for the Demi-Human Queen Gillica, 174 for the Crystallians in Liurnia, 173 for the Crystallians in the Altus Plateau, 172 for the Fallingstar Beast in Shadow Altus, 171 for the Beastmen of Fair Missoula, 170 for the Ghostflame Dragon in Shadow Altus, 169 for the Onyx Lord in the Royal Capital, 168 for the Demi-Human Queen Marigga, 167 for the Stray Mimic Tier, 166 for the Cleanrot Knights, 165 for Dryleaf Dane, 164 for the Tibia Mariner in the Altus Plateau, 163 for the Ulcerated Tree Spirit in Limgrave, 162 for the Tibia Mariner in Limgrave, 161 for Metyr, Mother of Fingers, 160 for the Rune Bear, 159 for Knight's Cavalry in the Altus Plateau, 158 for the Dragonkin Soldier in the Siofra River, 157 for the Frenzied Duelist, 156 for Chief Bloodfiend, 155 for the Puterscent 154 for Esker Priest of Blood, and at the top of the D grade, 153 for the Fallingstar Beast in Caelid. For the C grade, 152 is the Mad Pumpkinhead in Limgrave, 151 is Red Bear, 150 is Patches, 149 is the Stone Digger Troll in Limgrave, 148 is the the Demi-Human Queen Maggie, 147 is the Double Knights Cavalry, 146 is Bowles the Carrion Knight, 145 is the Ulcerated Tree Spirit in the Mountaintops, 144 is the Ghostflame Dragon in the Cerulean Coast, 143 is the Knights Cavalry in Caelid, 142 is the Dancer of Ranah, 141 is the Putrid Grave Warden Duelist, 140 is Perfumatricia and the Misbegotten Warrior, 139 is the Dragonkin Soldier in the Lake of Rot, 138 is the Glintstone Dragon Smaragd, 137 is the Ulcerated Tree Spirit in Mount Gelmir, 136 is the Beast Manifair Missoula in Limgrave, 135 is the Putrid Tree Spirit, 134 is the Cleanrot Knight, 133 is the Deathburn Limgrave, 132 is the Knights Cavalry in the Dragon Barrow, 131 is the Dragonkin Soldier of Noxtella, 130 is Black Knight Edredd, 129 is Black Knight Garrew, 128 is the Deathbird in the Royal Capital, 127 is the Erdtree Burial Watchdogs, 126 is the fully grown Fallingstar Beast, 125 is the Knights Cavalry in Limgrave, 124 is the Knights Cavalry in the Weeping Peninsula, 123 is the Roundtable Knight Vike, 122 is Big E, also known as Decaying Exeeks, 121 is Rakshasa, 120 is the Erdtree Burial Watchdog in the Altus Plateau, 119 is the Magma Worm in Caelid, 118 is the Knights Cavalry in the Mountaintop, 117 is the Bloodhound Knight in Liurnia, 116 is the Ancient Hero of Zamor in the Altus Plateau, 115 is the Grave Warden Duelist in the Royal Capital, 114 is the Deathrite Bird in the Cerulean Coast, 113 is the Flying Dragon Grail in the Dragon Barrow, 112 is the Flying Dragon Gael, 111 is Estelle Stars of Darkness, 110 is Grave Warden Duelist in Limgrave, 109 is the Double Tree Sentinels in the Royal Capital, 108 is the Glintstone Dragon Adula, 107 is the Dueling Jagged Peak Drakes, 106 is Elden Beast, and as the exact average boss at the top of the C grade, number 105 is the Crucible Knight in Limgrave. The B grade is 104 for the Demi-Human Chiefs in Limgrave, 103 is the Abductor versions, 102 is the Ancient Hero of Zamor in the Mountaintops, 101 is the Knights Cavalry in North Liurnia, and 100th place, the Knights Cavalry in Southern Liurnia. Number 99, Ancient Hero of Zamor in the Peninsula. Number 98, the Deathbird in the Peninsula. Number 97, the Putrid Avatar in the Snowfield. Number 96, the Deathrite Bird in Caelid. Number 95, Wormface. Number 94, the Fallingstar Beast in the Altus Plateau. Number 93, Borealis, the Freezing Fog. Number 92, the Jagged Peak Drake. Number 91, the Great Worm Theodorix. Number 90, the Black Knife Assassin in the Altus Plateau Overworld. Number 89, the Erdtree Avatar in the Mountaintops. Number 88, the Knight of the Solitary Jail. Number 87, the Erdtree Burial Watchdog in Limgrave. Number 86, the Fell Twins. Number 85, the Erdtree Burial Watchdog in Liurnia. Number 84, the Ghostflame Dragon in the Gravesite Plains. Number 83, the Godskin Duo. Number 82, Rugalea, the Great Red Bear. Number 81, the Black Knife Assassin in Liurnia. Number 80, the Black Knife Assassin in Limgrave. Number 79, the Bloodhound Knight Darrowil. Number 78, the Ancient Dragon Man. Number 77, Magma Worm and Mount Gelmir. Number 76, the Black Knife Assassin in the Altus Plateau, who is invisible. Number 75 is the Magma Worm Makar. Number 74 is the Erdtree Avatar in the Peninsula. Number 73 is the Erdtree Avatar in southwestern Liurnia. Number 72 is the Erdtree Avatar in northeast Liurnia. Number 71 is the Omen Killer. 70 is the Putrid Avatar in the Dragon Barrow. 69 is the Red Wolf of the Champion. 68 for the Tree Sentinels in Shadow Altus. 67 is the Ancient Dragon Lanciax. 66 is Jory, Elder Inquisitor. Number 65 is the Deathbird in Liurnia. Number 64 is the Putrid Avatar in Caelid. Number 63 is Deathrite Bird in the Mountaintops. 62, Deathrite Bird in the Snowfield. 61 is the Crucible Knight Siluria. 60 is the Misbegotten Crusader. 59 is the Demi-Human Swordsman Onze. 58 is the Crucible Knight Ordovis. 57 is the Scadutree Avatar. 56 is the Fire Giant. 55 is the Mimic Tear. 54 is Ralva, the Great Red Bear. 53 is the Godskin Apostle in the Dragon Barrow. 52 is the Deathrite Bird in Liurnia. 51 is the Bell-Bearing Hunter in Liurnia. 50 is the Golden Hippopotamus. 49 is the Godskin Noble. 48 is the Ancestor Spirit. 47 is the Royal Knight Loretta. 46 is Loretta, Knight of the Halig Tree. 45 is Elmer of the Briar. 44 is the proper Divine Beast Dancing Lion. And 43 at the top of B grade is Melania, Blade of Mikola. Starting the A grade at number 42 is Sir Gideon Ofnir the All-Knowing. 41, Leona Misbegotten. 40, the Spirit Caller Snail in the Mountaintop. 39, the Black Blade Kindred in the Mountaintop. 38 is the Red Wolf of Radagon in Rea Lucaria. 37 is the Bell-Bearing Hunter in the Dragon Barrow. 36 is the Lich Dragon Fortisax. 35 is the Death Knight with the Halberd. 34 is Estelle, Natural Born of the Void. 33 is the Blackblade Kindred in the Dragon Barrow. 32 is Dragonlord Placidusax. 31 is the Bell-Bearing Hunter in the Royal Capital. 30 is the Tree Sentinel in Limgrave. 29 is the Draconic Tree Sentinel. 28 is Godfrey, the first Elden Lord. 27 is the Regal Ancestor Spirit. 26 is Electo, the Black Knife Ringleader. 25 is Commander O'Neill. 24 is Commander Niall. 23 is Commander Gaius. 22 is Needle Knight Leda, Dryleaf Dane, and her allies. 21 is the Godskin Apostle in Altus Plateau. 20 is the Bell-Bearing Hunter in Limgrave. 19 is Promised Consort Radahn. 18 is Margit the Fell Omen. 17 is the Death Knight with axes. 16 is Moog the Omen. 15 is the Puterscent Knight. 14 is Malekith the Black Blade. Then in the S grade, 13 is Morgott the Omen King. 12 is Rennala, Queen of the Full Moon. 11 is Ramina, Saint of the Bud. 10 is Starscourge Radahn. 9 is Radagon of the Golden Order. 8 is Rellana, Twin Moon Knight. 7 is Moog, Lord of Blood. 6 is Rykard, Lord of Blasphemy. 5 is Bayle the Dread. 4 is Horalu, Warrior. 3 is Godric the Grafted. 2 is Messmer the Impaler. And my favorite boss in Elden Ring is Midra, Lord of the Frenzied Flame. Thank you so much for watching. Overall, the Curseblade Labirith. Overall, the Curseblade Labirith. Overall, the Curseblade Labirith. Overall, the Curseblade Labirith. Though the attacks can get hectic, being able to backstab Jory are threatening. There's a lot of dangerous stuff here, and there's a lot of detail in figuring out how to... And a weapon art that creates the shame. Red Bear feels more The Death Knight feels incredibly fragile. The player is introduced that the dragon, like the Ghostflame dragon, the dragon. There we go.